Thank you for downloading the book from the royalib.com free e-library, http://royalib.com. All books by the author, https://royalib.com/author/Bogomolov_Vladimir.html. The same book in other formats, https://royalib.com/book/Bogomolov_Vladimir/moment_is-teeny.html. Enjoy reading. Vladimir Osipovich Bogomolov. Moment of Truth. In August 44th. Novel. 1926 to 2003. Briefly about the author. Vladimir Osipovich Bogomolov was born on July 3, 1926 in the village of Kirilovna, Moscow region. He is a participant in the Great Patriotic War, was wounded, awarded orders and medals. Fought in Belarus, Poland, Germany, Manchuria. Bogomolov's first work is the story Ivan, 1957, a tragic story about a scout boy who died at the hands of fascist invaders. The story contains a fundamentally new view of the war, free from ideological schemes, from the literary standards of that time. The reader's and publisher's interest in this work does not disappear over the years, it has been translated into more than 40 languages. On its basis, director A. Tarkovsky created the film Ivan's Childhood, 1962. The story Zosia, 1963, tells with great psychological certainty about the first youthful love of a Russian officer for a Polish girl. The feeling experienced during the war years was not forgotten. At the end of the story, her hero admits, "To this day, I still have the feeling that I really overslept something then, that in my life, indeed, by some chance, something very important did not take place, big and unique." There are also short stories about the war in Bogomolov's work. First Love, 1958, Cemetery near Białystok, 1963, My Heart Pain, 1963. In 1963, several stories were written on other topics: second grade, people around, ward neighbor, district officer, apartment neighbor. In 1973, Bogomolov finished work on the novel, The Moment of Truth, in August 44th. In the novel about military counterintelligence officers, the author revealed to the readers the field of military activity, with which he himself was well acquainted. This is a story about how an operational search group of counterintelligence neutralized a group of fascist paratrooper agents. The work of the command structures up to the headquarters is shown. Military service documents are woven into the fabric of the plot, carrying a great cognitive and expressive load. This novel, like the previously written stories, Ivan and Zosia, is one of the best works of our literature about the Great Patriotic War. The novel has been translated into more than 30 languages. In 1993, Bogomolov wrote the story, in the Krieger. Its action takes place in the Far East, in the first post-war autumn. The military personnel officers stationed in the Krieger, a car for transporting the seriously wounded, hand out assignments to remote garrisons to officers who have returned from the front. In the last years of his life, Bogomolov worked on a publicistic book, Shame on Both the Living and the Dead, and Russia, which examined publications, as the writer himself said, denigrating the patriotic war and tens of millions of its living and dead participants. Vladimir Osipovich Bogomolov passed away in 2003. Moment of Truth. In August 44th. 1. Alekin, Tamantsev, Blinov. There were 3 of them, those who officially, in the documents, were called the Operational Search Group of the front's counterintelligence department. At their disposal was a car, a battered GAZAA lorry and a driver, Sergeant Kizniak. Exhausted by 6 days of intensive but unsuccessful searches, they returned to the office after dark, confident that at least tomorrow they would be able to sleep off and rest. However, as soon as the head of the group, Captain Alekin, reported their arrival, they were ordered to immediately go to the Shilovichi area and continue the search. 2 hours later, having filled the car with gasoline and having received an energetic briefing during dinner by a specially called officer minor, they drove off. By dawn, more than 150 kilometers were left behind. The sun had not yet risen, but it was already dawning when Kizniak, stopping the lorry, stepped on the footboard and, leaning over the side, pushed Alekhin aside. The captain, of average height, thin, with faded, whitish eyebrows on a tanned, inactive face, threw back his overcoat and, shivering, sat up in the back. The car was parked on the side of the highway. It was very quiet, fresh and dewy. Ahead, about 1.5 kilometers away, the huts of some village could be seen in small dark pyramids. "Shilovichi," said Kizniak. Raising the side shield of the hood, he leaned toward the engine. "Move closer?" "No," said Alekhin, looking around. "Good." To the left was a stream with sloping dry banks. To the right of the Gloss, behind a wide strip of stubble and bushes, stretched the forest. The same forest from which some 11 hours ago there was a radio transmission. Alekhin examined him through binoculars for half a minute, then began to wake up the officers who were sleeping in the back. One of them, Andrei Blinov, a light-headed lieutenant of 19 years of age, with ruddy cheeks from sleep, woke up immediately, sat down on the hay, rubbed his eyes and stared at Alekhin without understanding anything. It was not so easy to get another one, Senior Lieutenant Timantsev. He slept with his head wrapped in a raincoat, and when they began to wake him up, he pulled it tight, half asleep, kicked the air twice with his foot and rolled over to the other side. At last he woke up completely and, realizing that they would not let him sleep any longer, threw off his raincoat, sat down and, looking around sullenly with dark gray eyes from under thick unibrows, asked, in fact, without addressing anyone. "Where are we?" "Let's go," Alekhin called him, going down to the stream, where Blinov and Kizniak were already washing. "Freshen up." Timantsev glanced at the stream, spat far to the side, and suddenly, almost without touching the edge of the side, rapidly tossing his body, jumped out of the car. He was, like Blinov, tall, but broader in the shoulders, narrower in the hips, muscular and wiry. Stretching and glancing around frowningly, he went down to the stream and, throwing off his tunic, began to wash. The water was cold and clear, like a spring. "It smells like a swamp," said Timantsev, however. "Note that in all rivers the water tastes like a swamp. Even in the Dnieper. You, of course, do not agree less than at sea." Wiping his face, Alekhin grinned. "Precisely. You won't understand this," Timantsev sighed, looking regretfully at the captain, and quickly turning around in an authoritative bass voice, but cheerfully exclaimed, "Kizniak, I don't see breakfast." "Do not be noisy." "There will be no breakfast," Alekhin said. "Take a dry ration. Cheerful life. No sleep, no food. Let's get in the body." Alekhin interrupted him and, turning to Kizniak, suggested, "In the meantime, take a walk." The officers climbed into the body. Alekhin lit a cigarette, then, taking it out of his tablet, laid out a brand new large-scale map on a plywood suitcase and, trying on, made a dot above the Shilovichi with a pencil. "We are here. Historic place." Timantsev snorted. "Shut up." Alekhin said sternly, and his face became official. "Listen to the order. See the forest? Here it is." Alekhin showed on the map. "Yesterday at 18:05, a shortwave transmitter went on the air from here. Is it still the same?" Blinov asked not quite confidently. "Yes. What about the text?" Timantsev inquired at once. "Presumably, the transmission was conducted from this square," Alekhin continued, as if not hearing his question. "We will. What does Enfei think?" Timantsev promptly managed. It was his usual question. He almost always asked, "What did Enfei say? What does Enfei think? And with Enfei did you pump it?" "I don't know, he didn't exist," Alekhin said. "Let's take a look at the forest. What about the text?" Timantsev insisted. "Let's explore the forest." Alekhin repeated firmly, raising his voice. "We need traces, fresh, daily old. Watch and memorize your sights." With barely visible pencil lines, he divided the northern part of the forest into 3 sectors, and, having shown and explained in detail to the officers the landmarks, he continued. We start from this square, look especially carefully here. And move to the periphery. Searches to conduct until 1900. Staying in the forest later, forbid. Gathering at the Shilovichi. The car will be somewhere in that undergrowth. Alekhin held out his hand, Andrei and Timantsev looked where he was pointing. Remove shoulder straps and caps, leave documents, do not keep weapons in plain sight. When meeting with someone in the forest, act according to the circumstances. Having unbuttoned the collars of their tunics, Timantsev and Blinov untied their shoulder straps, Alekhin dragged on and continued. Don't relax for a moment. Always be aware of mines and the possibility of a surprise attack. Note, Bezos was killed in this forest. Throwing away his cigarette, he glanced at his watch, got up and ordered. Get started. 2. Operational documents. 1. Summary. To the Chief of the Main Directorate of Troops for the Protection of the Rear of the Red Army. Copy. To the Head of the Counterintelligence Department Smersh, 2, of the Front. August 13, 1944. The operational situation at the front and in the rear of the front for 50 days from the start of the offensive, through August 11, was characterized by the following main factors. Successful offensive operations of our troops and the absence of a continuous front line. The liberation of the entire territory of the BSSR and a significant part of the territory of Lithuania, which had been under German occupation for more than 3 years. The defeat of the enemy army group Center, which consisted of about 50 divisions. The contamination of the liberated territory by numerous agents of counterintelligence and punitive bodies of the enemy, his accomplices, traitors and traitors to the motherland, most of whom, avoiding responsibility, went into an illegal position, unite in gangs, hide in forests and farms. The presence in the rear of the front of hundreds of scattered residual groups of soldiers and officers of the enemy. The presence in the liberated territory of various underground nationalist organizations and armed formations, numerous manifestations of banditry. The regrouping and concentration of our troops carried out by the headquarters and the enemy's desire to unravel the plans of the Soviet command, to establish where and by what forces subsequent strikes will be delivered. Related factors. An abundance of wooded areas, including large thickets, which serve as a good shelter for the remaining groups of the enemy, various bandit formations and persons evading mobilization. A large number of weapons left on the battlefields, which makes it possible for hostile elements to arm themselves without difficulty. Weakness, understaffing of the restored local bodies of Soviet power and institutions, especially in the lower levels. A significant length of frontline communications and a large number of objects requiring reliable protection. A pronounced shortage of personnel in the troops of the front, which makes it difficult to obtain support from units and formations during operations to clear military rear areas. Remaining groups of Germans. Scattered groups of enemy soldiers and officers in the first half of July strove for one common goal, secretly or fighting moving west, to pass through the battle formations of our troops and connect with their units. However, on July 15 to 20, the German command repeatedly transmitted encrypted radiograms an order to all residual groups with walkie-talkies and ciphers not to force the crossing of the front line, but, on the contrary, remaining in our operational rear, to collect and transmit intelligence information in cipher by radio, and above all on the deployment, number and movement of units of the Red Army. To this end, it was proposed, in particular, using natural shelters, to monitor our frontline railway and highway communications, record the flow of cargo, and also capture single Soviet military personnel. Underground nationalist organizations and formations. 1. According to our information, the following underground organizations of the Polish government in exile in London operate in the rear of the front: People's Forces Zbrojne, the Home Army, 3. The Dnepodleglost, created in recent weeks and, on the territory of the Lithuanian SSR, in the district not the city of Vilnius, delegation of Zondu. The core of these illegal formations is made up of Polish officers and sub-officers of the reserve, landowner bourgeois elements, and partly the intelligentsia. The leadership of all organizations is carried out from London by General Sosnkowski through his representatives in Poland, General Burr, Count Tadeusz Komorowski, Colonels Gregors, Pelczynski, and Neil, Fieldorf. As established, the London Centre gave the Polish underground a directive to carry out active subversive activities in the rear of the Red Army, for which it was ordered to keep most of the detachments, weapons and all transceiver radio stations in an illegal position. Colonel Fieldorf, who visited in June with Vilna and Novogrodok districts, specific orders were given on the ground with the arrival of the Red Army, a. to sabotage the activities of the military and civil authorities, b. commit acts of sabotage on frontline communications and terrorist acts against Soviet military personnel, local leaders and activists, c. collect and transmit in cipher to General Burr Komorowski and directly to London intelligence information about the Red Army and the situation in its rear. In the intercepted on July 28 with and the decoded radiogram from the London Centre, all underground organizations are invited not to recognize the Polish Committee of National Liberation formed in Lublin and to sabotage its activities, in particular, mobilization into the Polish army. It also draws attention to the need for active military intelligence in the rear of the active Soviet armies, for which it is ordered to establish constant monitoring of all railway junctions. The greatest terrorist and sabotage activity is shown by the Folka detachments, Rudnitskaya Puszcza district, Kryzia, Vilnius district, and Ragnar, about 300 people, in the Lida district. 2. In the liberated territory of the Lithuanian SSR, armed nationalist gangs of the so-called LLA, hiding in the forests and settlements, are operating, calling themselves Lithuanian partisans. The basis of these underground formations is made up of white armbanders and other active German accomplices, officers and junior commanders of the former Lithuanian army, landlord Kulak and other enemy elements. The actions of these detachments are coordinated by the Committee of the Lithuanian National Front, created on the initiative of the German command and its intelligence agencies. According to the testimonies of the arrested members of the LLA, in addition to carrying out cruel terror against Soviet military personnel and representatives of local authorities, the Lithuanian underground has the task of conducting operational intelligence in the rear and on communications of the Red Army and immediately transmitting the information obtained, for which many bandit groups are equipped with shortwave radio stations, ciphers and German decryption notebooks. The most characteristic hostile manifestations of the last period. From 1 to August 10 inclusive. In Vilnius and its environs, mainly at night, 11 Red Army servicemen, including 7 officers, were killed or went missing. A major of the Polish army, who arrived on a short vacation to meet with his relatives, was also killed there. On August 2, a water pumping station at the Bastony station was blown up and burned. August 2 at 4:00 in the village. The family of the former partisan, who is now in the ranks of the Red Army, Makarevich V.I., was brutally destroyed by unknown people of Kalatany, wife, daughter and niece born in 1940. On August 3, in the Zermuni region, 20 kilometers north of the city of Lida, a Vlasov bandit group fired on a car, 5 Red Army soldiers were killed, a colonel and a major were seriously wounded. On the night of August 5, the railway bed between the Neman and Novoelnya stations was blown up in 3 places. August 5, 1944 in the village Turchula, 30 kilometers south of Vilnius, a communist, a deputy of the village council, was killed by a grenade thrown through the window. August 7 in the district with Wojtowice was attacked from a pre-prepared ambush car of the 39th Army. As a result, 13 people were killed. 11 of them were burned along with the car. 2 people were taken into the forest by bandits who also seized weapons, uniforms and all personal official documents. August 6 arrived on a visit to the village. Raden, a sergeant of the Polish army, was abducted by unknown people on the same night. On August 8, on the stretch Lida, Vilnius, a military echelon with ammunition was derailed. On August 10, at 4:30 a.m., a Lithuanian gang of unidentified numbers attacked the Volus department of the NKVD in the town of Siasiki. 4 police officers were killed, 6 bandits were released from custody. August 10th in with Maly Soloshniki shot the chairman of the village council Vasilevsky, his wife and 13-year-old daughter, who tried to protect her father. In total, in the rear of the front during the first 10 days of August, 169 Red Army servicemen were killed, kidnapped and went missing. Most of the dead were confiscated weapons, uniforms and personal military documents. During these 10 days, 13 representatives of local authorities were killed, buildings of village councils were burned in 3 settlements. In connection with numerous gang manifestations and murders of military personnel, we and the Army Command have significantly strengthened security measures. By order of the Commander, all personnel of units and formations of the front are allowed to go beyond the location of the unit only in groups of at least 3 people and provided that each of them has automatic weapons. The same order prohibited the movement of vehicles in the evening and at night outside settlements without proper protection. In total from June 23 to August 11 with 209 enemy armed groups and various bandit formations operating in the rear of the front were liquidated, not counting single individuals. At the same time, the following were captured: mortars, 22, machine guns, 356, rifles and machine guns, 3827, horses, 190, radio stations, 46, including 28 shortwave ones. Chief of the Troops for the Protection of the Rear of the Front, Major General Lobov. Note on HF, 4. Urgently. Moscow, Matyushin. In addition to No. of August 7, 44. The unknown radio station we are looking for in the Neman case with the call signs KAO, the interception of August 7, 44 was immediately handed over to you. Today, August 13, went on the air from a forest in the Shilovichi district, Baranovichi region, 5. Reporting the groups of digits of the encrypted radiogram recorded today, I urgently ask you, given the lack of qualified cryptographers in the counterintelligence department of the front, to expedite the decryption of both the first and second radio intercepts. Igorov. Note on HF. Urgently. Head of the Main Directorate of Counterintelligence. Smersh. Special message. Today, August 13, at 18:05, tracking stations again recorded the going on the air of an unknown shortwave radio with the call signs of KAO, operating in the rear of the front. The place where the transmitter goes on the air is determined as the northern part of the Shilovichi forest area. The operating frequency of the radio is 4627 kHz. A recorded intercept is a radiogram encrypted with groups of 5-digit digits. The speed and clarity of transmission testify to the high qualification of the radio operator. Prior to this, the release of the radio with the call signs of KAO was recorded on the air on August 7 this year. From the forest southeast of Stolbtsi, the search activities carried out in the first case did not give positive results. It seems likely that the transmissions are carried out by agents left by the enemy during the retreat or transferred to the rear of the front. It is possible, however, that the radio with the call signs KAO is used by one of the underground groups of the Home Army. It is also possible that the transmissions are carried out by one of the remaining groups of Germans. We are taking measures to find in the Shilovichi forest area the exact place where the wanted radio went on the air, to find traces and evidence. At the same time, everything possible is being done to identify information that would facilitate the identification and detention of persons involved in the work of the transmitter. All radio reconnaissance groups of the front are aimed at the operational direction finding of the radio if it goes on the air. The task force of Captain Alekine is working directly on the case. All counterintelligence agencies of the front, the head of the troops for the protection of the rear, as well as the counterintelligence directorate of neighboring fronts, are oriented by us to search for the radio and the persons involved in its work. Igorov. 3. Cleaner, 6. Senior Lieutenant Timantsev, nicknamed Skorokvat. In the morning I was in a terrible, downright funeral mood. Leshka Bezos, my closest friend and probably the best guy on earth, was killed in this forest. And although he died about 3 weeks ago, I could not help thinking about him all day. I was then on a mission, and when I returned, he was already buried. I was told that there were many wounds and severe burns on the body. Before his death, the wounded man was severely tortured, apparently trying to find out something, stabbed with knives, burned his feet, chest and face, and then finished off with 2 shots in the back of the head. In the school of junior commanders of the border troops, for almost a year we slept on the same bunk, and his head with the 2 tops so familiar to me and curls of reddish hair around his neck loomed before my eyes in the morning. He fought for 3 years, and did not die in open battle. Somewhere here he was caught, and it is not known who. Shot, apparently, from an ambush, tortured, burned, and then killed. How I hated this accursed forest. Thirst for revenge, to meet and reckon, has taken over me since morning. Mood is mood, but business is business. We did not come here to commemorate Leshka and not even to avenge him. If the forest near Stolbtsi, where we searched until yesterday afternoon, seemed to have bypassed the war, then here it was quite the opposite. At the very beginning, about 200 meters from the edge of the forest, I stumbled upon a burnt-out German staff car. It was not knocked out, but burned by the Fritz themselves. The trees here completely blocked the path and it became impossible to drive. A little later I saw 2 corpses under the bushes. More precisely, the fetid skeletons in half-decayed dark German uniforms are tankers. And further on the overgrown paths of this dense, thicket forest, I now and then came across rusted rifles and machine guns with their bolts taken out, dirty red bandages and cotton wool stained with blood, abandoned boxes and packs of cartridges, empty cans and scraps of papers, Fritz's hiking bags with reddish calfskin tops and soldiers' helmets. Already in the afternoon, in the thicket itself, I discovered 2 grave mounds about a month old, which had time to settle, with hastily knocked together birch crosses and inscriptions burnt out in Gothic letters on light crossbars. When retreating, they most often plowed up their cemeteries, destroyed them, fearing abuse. And here, in a secluded place, they marked everything with a rank, obviously hoping to return again. Jokers, nothing to say. In the same place, behind the bushes, lay a sanitary stretcher. As I thought, these Fritzes only ran out here. They were carried, wounded, tens, or maybe hundreds of kilometers. They didn't shoot me, as they used to, and they didn't abandon me. I liked that. During the day, I met hundreds of all kinds of signs of war and a hasty German retreat. There was, perhaps, only what we were interested in this forest, fresh, a day old, traces of a person's stay here. As for the mines, the devil is not as terrible as he is painted. All day I came across only one, German anti-personnel. I noticed a thin steel wire flashing in the grass, stretched across the path about 15 centimeters from the ground. If I hit it, my intestines and other remains would hang on trees or somewhere else. During the 3 years of the war, everything happened, but I myself had to defuse the mines a few times, and I did not consider it necessary to waste time on this one. Marking it on both sides with sticks, I moved on. Although during the day I came across only one, the very idea that the forest was mined in places and that at any moment you could fly into the air, all the time put pressure on the psyche, creating some kind of foul internal tension that I could not get rid of. In the afternoon, going out to the stream, I took off my boots, spread my foot cloths in the sun, washed my face and had a snack. I got drunk and lay for about 10 minutes, resting my raised legs on the trunk of a tree and thinking about those whom we were hunting. Yesterday they went on the air from this forest, a week ago, near Stolbtsi, and tomorrow they can appear anywhere, beyond Grodno, near Brest, or somewhere in the Baltic states. Wandering walkie-talkie, Figaro here, Figaro there. Finding an exit point in such a forest is like finding a needle in a haystack. This is not your mother's melon, where every cavern is familiar and personally likable. And the whole calculation that there will be traces, there will be a clue. The trait of a bald man, why should they inherit? We didn't try under Stolbtsi. We dug the earth with our nose. 5 of us, 6 days. What's the point? As they say, 2 tin cans plus a hole from the steering wheel. And this array is bigger, quieter and pretty clogged. I would like to come here with an intelligent dog like the tiger that I had before the war. But it's not on the border for you. At the sight of a service dog, it becomes clear to everyone that they are looking for someone, and the authorities do not favor dogs. The authorities, like all of us, are concerned about conspiracy. By the end of the day, I again thought, we need a text. In it, you can almost always catch at least some information about the area where the wanted people are located and what interests them. From the text and should dance. I knew that the decryption went wrong and the interception was reported to Moscow. And they have 12 fronts, military districts and their affairs to the eyeballs. You can't tell Moscow, they are their own bosses. And the soul is taken out of us. It's like giving a drink. Old song, die, but do it. 4. In Shilovichi. Leaving Kisnyak with the car in the dense undergrowth near the village, Alekin went out into the street through an abandoned, overgrown vegetable garden. The first person he met, a freckled boy who was chasing a goose at the well early in the morning, showed him the hut of the foreman of the village council. It could be distinguished from neighboring, equally nondescript, mossy-roofed huts only by the fact that instead of a gate in the fence, a door from a German car was hung. The boy also named the name of the chairman, Vasyukov. Ignoring the skinny dog that was grabbing his boots, Alekin went to the hut. The door was closed and locked from the inside. He knocked. I could hear someone walking in the house. Half a minute passed, a noise was heard in the passage, slow heavy steps, and then everything froze. Alekin felt that he was being examined, and so that the one standing outside the door would understand that he was not a disguised Akavite and not a Green, but a Russian, he sang in an undertone. I will remember the infantry, and my native company. And you, the one who gave me a smoke. Finally the door opened. In front of Alekin, looking intently and warily, leaning on crutches and wincing painfully, stood a short, 35-year-old man with a pale, thin face covered with reddish stubble, in a Polish protective jacket and worn trousers. He had no left leg, and the trouser leg, crookedly sewn in at the level of the knee, dangled freely. In his right half-bent hand he held a revolver. This was the chairman of the village council Vasyukov. They walked through the empty, dirty vestibule into a hut furnished very poorly, an old wooden bed, a dilapidated thin-legged table and a bench. Darkened log walls, completely bare, on the stove, a torn mattress and a pile of rags. On a wooden table there is a lid, a plate with the remnants of bread and a glass of milk. Immediately, staring at the window with its barrel, stood a German light machine gun. At the head of the bed, thrown over by a rusty soldier's overcoat, hung a trophy machine gun. The air in the hut was sour and stale. Vasyukov grabbed an old embroidered towel and wiped the bench. Alekin sat down. Without leaving the crutches, Vasyukov sank down on the bed and looked expectantly. Alekin began from afar. He asked what village councils, 7, and farms were included in the village council, how grain was harvested, how many peasants, as with tax, and asked a few more questions of a general nature. Vasyukov answered in detail, unhurriedly, holding his stump with his left hand and wincing painfully from time to time. He knew both the area and the people well. Polish and Belarusian words slipped through his conversation, but Alekin immediately determined from his dialect, not a local. Are you not from here? Seizing the moment, asked the captain. I am Smolensky. And here he was surrounded in the 41st and partisan for 3 years. And so it remained. What business are you on? In turn asked Vasyukov. Alekin got up, took out a travel order and, unfolding it, presented it. For you, to fulfill the task of command, the chairman read slowly. Clear question. After examining the seal, he said a little later, returning the document and, however, not at all imagining what task this infantry captain with field epaulets could perform on a burnt-out tunic in Shilovichi, more than 100 kilometers from the front line. And Alekin, who was watching the expression on Vasyukov's face, understood this. He looked back at the partition and, hearing from Vasyukov, "There is no one there," he looked the disabled chairman in the eyes and in a low voice confidentially said, I'm on the part of staying, quartering. Perhaps they will stand with you. Not now, but closer to winter, in a month and a half or two, not earlier. Only about this yet to anyone. Well, what are you? Vasyukov said understandingly, clearly flattered by the trust. Am I clueless? And put a lot? Yes, I think there is about a company in Shilovichi. This is up to the command to decide. My job is to get acquainted with the situation, see the area and report back. Roth, it's possible. And no more to place, said Vasyukov anxiously. You will report so, more company is impossible. After all, they need to be treated. I myself served for 3 years, I was a squad leader, I understand. A soldier gets it in battle, and conditions are needed for standing. And where to get them? He sighed. How is your water? Water is enough for everyone. And wood is plentiful. But with housing Kapsko, 8. The floors are more and more earthen, cold. Where do you get your wood? Alekhin asked, trying to direct the conversation in the right direction. Right there, behind the highway. Vasyukov nodded to the left, towards the stove. But you have a forest nearby. Alekhin was surprised, pointing in the opposite direction. He was primarily interested in this forest and what was connected with it. There, behind the highway, firewood, 9, was prepared by the Germans. Dry as a torch, and no need to saw. And they carry him, Vasyukov explained. But they don't go to this forest, it's forbidden. Why? Here the Germans, as they retreated, they must have thought to keep the defense. Or they wanted to stop the persecution. In a word, minds were set. I understand. Hang on, 10, and a little, but where and how much, no one knows. On the day I was appointed, the boys climbed there. 4 trophies. And 2 at the very edge, to pieces. We immediately placed signs along the edge. Like, the passage is prohibited, mines. So our, Shilovichi, not a step into this forest. And there was a case with the military. With what military? We've had signalers here for a week. Young, cheerful, you know, on vacation. And in the forest of mushrooms, berries are full. And then 2 went, but did not return. How long has it been? It's been 10 days. They began to look for them, they found them about 300 meters from the edge, right there. Vasyukov glanced at the wall where the machine gun hung. They were raped and killed. Uniforms were taken away and documents. Who killed it? And who knows? After that, the NKVD from Lida arrived. Border guards. In 3 cars, with dogs. They examined the forest, there was a shootout, as if they had found someone and beaten them. Again, they say, someone blew up on a mine. But I don't know for sure, combing, so they started from us, but they didn't come anymore. That must have been the way they went through the forest to Kamenka. It was, say, a week ago. But in recent days, yesterday or the day before yesterday, have you met strangers here? Did you see military personnel? Why am I asking? The captain explained. Besides me, 3 more groups of lodgers were sent. So if we look after the same villages or farms for a stay, it will turn out to be nonsense. I see. No, they haven't asked about apartments for the last few days. But I saw 2 commanders yesterday. Musit, and from your unit, Vasyukov noted uncertainly. But they didn't come to me. Where did you see them? In the village? Not. I settled a dispute here yesterday. Tesinsky and Semashko. They were torn apart because of the boundary. Let's go to the field, right here. Vasyukov showed his hand behind his back. They measured everything, buried the pole. Well, after the case, as usual, bread and salt, they drank a bottle of bimber. We sit at the kopshki, we have a snack. And I see, 2 people are coming from the forest. Commanders. Musit, and from your part. When was that? What time? In the evening. Before entering. At 8 o'clock it must be. And what are they like? What do they look like? Usually. One is older and thicker. He walked ahead. And the other is thin, younger, you see, this one is longer. The one that is older, so swarthy, big-nosed. This is Leshchenko. Alekhin said delightedly, naming the first surname that came to mind. Captain. In chrome boots and a tunic. He also has a cap with a cloth visor. There are 200 meters, if not more. Can you figure out the title? But only in caps, they are both in tunics. That's for sure. Maybe Tkachev and Zerba? Alekhin said as if thinking aloud. Did they come out of the forest? Did they have any things with them? When I saw them, they were coming from the forest. Whether they were there or not, I don't know. And I didn't see things. One must have a raincoat in his hand, and the other, like nothing at all. And these, Tesinsky and Semashko, saw them? Maybe they got a better look? Not. I have a distant eye. If I didn't see, and those are even more so. That's for sure. They talked for another 10 minutes. Alekhin gradually clarified most of the questions that interested him and wondered whether to go straight from here to Kamenka or look along the road at the farms located along the forest. Vasyukov, at the end of the conversation, spoke confidentially about a peasant he knew who had a apparatus, and, smiling mischievously, suggested. If you have to stand here, we will definitely go to him. He has a glove, it takes your breath away. Alekhin, who is very indifferent to moonshine, had that joyfully animated expression on his face, which appears in alcohol lovers as soon as they smell of booze. Restraining himself so as not to overact, he lowered his eyes and said in agreement. If we stand here, we'll figure it out. By all means. He got up to leave. At that moment the pile of rags on the stove stirred. Looking perplexed, Alekhin became alert. Vasyukov, with the help of crutches, ran up to the stove, stretched himself as best he could, and, thrusting his hand into the rags, pulled out and quickly put on the floor a boy of about 2.5 years old, white-haired, in a washed-out shirt. Son, he explained. Looking out from behind his father's leg and rubbing his clear bluish eyes with his fist, the child looked at the unfamiliar military man for several seconds and suddenly smiled. What is your name? Alekhin asked affectionately and cheerfully. Paltizan. The kid answered briskly. Vasyukov, smiling, stepped aside. And only then Alekhin noticed that the boy had no left arm. An unusually small crimson stump peeped out of the short sleeve of his shirt. Alekhin was unsentimental and had seen everything during the war. And yet he felt uneasy at the sight of this tiny cripple, with such a captivating smile looking into his eyes. And, unable to restrain himself, he said. How is it, huh? He was in the team. In Naliboki they squeezed us, a fragment of a mine hit us, Vasyukov sighed. Well, wash up. He told his son. The little boy darted nimbly behind the partition. And where is the wife? Alekhin asked. Gone. Rearranging the crutches, Vasyukov turned his back on Alekhin and stepped behind the partition. I ran away to the city. With furs hell. Leaning on a crutch and bending over, he poured water from a mug, and the baby, standing over a padded enameled basin, carefully and hurriedly rubbed his grubby muzzle with his palm. Alekhin cursed himself in his heart. He shouldn't have asked about his wife. Answering, Vasyukov fell silent, closed himself, and his face became gloomy. After washing, the boy hurriedly dried himself with the same towel with which his father wiped the bench for Alekhin, and deftly pulled on his small, green-stained panties. Meanwhile, his father, silently and without looking at Alekhin, cut off a loaf of bread, thrust it into his son's tenacious hand, and, having removed the machine gun from the wall, hung it on his chest. Alekhin went out first and was already stepping on the dewy grass, when, hearing a strangled groan from behind, he quickly turned around. Vasyukov, clenching his teeth and closing his eyes, stood leaning against the doorframe. Beads of sweat appeared on his sickly pale face. The child, who was celebrating a small need at the very threshold, froze and, with his head thrown back, looked at his father with frightened, not childishly preoccupied eyes. "What's wrong with you?" Alekin rushed to Vasyukov. "Nothing," whispered Vasyukov, half opening his eyes. "The wound has opened. It's already the third day. It must be that the bone is coming out. It's moribund, there's no urine." And then he touched it with a crutch, it already darkened in his eyes. "You need to go to the hospital," Alekin declared with determination, thinking how best to arrange this. "I'll take care of the car, they'll take you to Lida today." "No, you can't," Vasyukov shook his head and, holding the crutch under his arm, adjusted the machine gun. "Are you afraid for the child? There is no one to leave with?" "No. But I can't go to the hospital." Grimacing in pain, Vasyukov rearranged his crutches and moved forward, throwing his leg forward and bouncing at every step. "The village council cannot be left." "Why?" Alekin, deftly opening the gate, let Vasyukov go ahead. "Do you have a deputy? They took him to the army." "There is no one. The secretary is a girl." "Unthinking." "No way. You see, I can't." Leaning on crutches, Vasyukov stood in the middle of the street and, looking around, said in an undertone, "Gangs showed up. On the third day 40 people came to Solomentsy. The chairman of the village council was killed, and his daughter and wife. The seal was taken." Alekin knew about the gangs, but he had not heard about the case in Solomentsy. And this village was nearby, and Alekin thought that in the forest where the search would be conducted, one could run into not only mines or a small group, but also a gang, easily. "How can I go to the hospital?" Vasyukov continued. "Yes, I'm here as a post. Alone, and there is no one to transfer the seal to. All the weight is watching me. I'll go to the hospital, and they'll think, I got scared, I ran away. No. I can't. I'm here, Soviet power, do you understand?" "Understand. I just think, well, in which case, what can you do?" "Everything," Vasyukov said with conviction, and his face became angry. "I'm a party, I won't give myself up alive." They were overtaken by 2 women, barefoot, in kerchiefs, and, saying the usual, "Good day," they walked aside, a little behind. Obviously, they needed a chairman, but they did not want to talk with him under Alekin or did not dare. Near the alley, Alekin said goodbye to Vasyukov, who tried to smile and quietly, as if guiltily or distressed, said, "And what kind of chairman am I? Education, 3 classes. And you can't go anywhere, there is no other." Having walked 30 paces, Alekin looked around, jumping up and down on crutches. Vasyukov was moving in the middle of the street, talking to women as he walked. Behind him, trying to keep up, ran a little boy with a piece of bread in his hand. 5. Cleaner probationer of the guard Lieutenant Andrei Blinov. This forest, with narrow, overgrown paths and large areas of impassable wilderness, looked wild in places, but was not at all untrodden, as it seemed from the outside. It was pretty littered and polluted by the war. The decomposed corpses of Germans in uniforms of various branches of the armed forces, boxes of ammunition and soldiers' satchels, yellowed scraps of newspapers printed in the Gothic type, and empty cigarette boxes, flasks and bowlers, bottles of rum, rusted rifles and machine guns without shutters, a burned motorcycle with a carriage, a mortar without a sight, and even a German divisional cannon, who knows how dragged into the depths of the forest, that just did not meet on the way to Andrei. All this obviously had nothing to do with what he was interested in. He passed by without stopping. The only thing that held his attention for a minute in the first half of the day was an old, decomposed corpse in half-decayed linen, with a piece of thick rope around its neck. Obviously hanged or strangled. Who? By whom? For what? Andrei had never seen such an abundance of mushrooms and berries as in this deserted forest. Bluish scatterings of blueberries, dark, overripe strawberries, must be incredibly sweet. He did not pick a single one, having promised himself to eat his fill only after he discovered something. However, there were no fresh, a day old, traces of a person in this forest. No footprints, no torn cobwebs, no remnants of food or a fire, no bent stems or bruises, no freshly broken branches, no other traces, nothing. Over the forest and as if over the whole earth there was a magnificent silence. Not a cloud appeared in the hot, dull blue sky. As soon as he was in the sun, the hot rays baked his head, burned his shoulders and back through his tunic. At noon, sitting down for a few minutes in the shade on the bank of the stream, Andrei ate a piece of canned sausage with a slice of black bread, got drunk, washed his face and, rewinding his foot-cloths, continued his search. He did not forget about the mines for a minute, but he came across them only in one place, at the fork in the forest roads. From a distance he noticed a spot of dried yellow grass the size of a large handkerchief. Approaching, he habitually lay down next to him, removed the turf, carefully dug up the ground, rummaged around with his fingers along the sides of the hole and below. About 2 minutes later, Spring Mine, an ordinary German anti-personnel S-34, devoid of a fuse unscrewed by Andrei, was lying behind a bush. He walked no more than 20 meters when he saw ahead, on a green background of grass, the same yellow spot. He didn't need yesterday's briefing at all. In a regiment in the Smolensk and Vitebsk regions, he happened to defuse hundreds, or maybe thousands of such mines with pressure and tension fuses, ordinary and with all sorts of surprises. He could neutralize them in the dark, with his eyes closed, and he did it now, after 8 hours of fruitless walking through the forest, with a sense of noticeable satisfaction. He was unloading the fourth when he thought, what is all this for? Why, if there, on the front line, the removed mines were an indicator of the combat activity of the platoon and himself as a commander, then here they were of no interest to anyone, since they had nothing to do with the case, the wanted radio and agents. They were just a feature of the area where the search was conducted. And, thinking about this, he did not waste any more time on them and simply marked the last two with sticks, but did not begin to discharge. And he walked again, stubbornly moving his legs in the thick, shaggy grass. Making his way entirely, he constantly deflected the branches with his hands, broke off the cobwebs with his flushed face, crawled under the lower branches. In an effort not to miss anything, he constantly turned his head, which made his neck hurt painfully. The pistol, which had become extraordinarily heavy, pulled down his pocket and rubbed his thigh, the sweat-soaked tunic and harem pants stuck to his body, his overworked legs burned with heat in his boots. He, like his comrades, had to sleep 4 or 5 hours a day for weeks. The constant lack of sleep exhausted even the strenuous Timantsev. Andrei sometimes just fell off his feet. And now he was in that nasty state when you just want to sleep, fall anywhere and sleep, sleep and sleep. With difficulty overcoming himself, stumbling with tired feet on routes that were exposed in some places, he persistently walked along overgrown paths so similar to each other. 6. Senior Group Captain Alekin Pavel Vasilyevich. The first day, in essence, did not give anything. In addition to Shilovichi, I also visited Kamenka and Novoselki, villages adjacent to the Shilovichi forest from the opposite side, and 24 neighboring farms. Those we were looking for were hardly in the forest. It seemed probable that yesterday or the day before yesterday they entered there, and after the transfer, without wasting time, they immediately disappeared. It was natural to believe that someone had seen them on the outskirts of the forest. The two unknowns noticed by Vasyukov certainly deserved our attention, but they had to be taken as a working version with significant reservations. Firstly, Vasyukov did not see whether these two had come from the forest or were moving along the edge of the forest before that. Maybe they were not in the forest. Secondly, the transmission was carried out from a site located closer to Novoselki than to Shilovichi, and in order to leave the array and quickly move away from the place where the radio went on the air, it was wiser not to go through the whole forest, but to quickly get out there on a busy highway and sit on a passing car. And thirdly, the most distressing thing for us, Vasyukov saw unknown people at a considerable distance, did not make out and could not at least approximately describe their appearance. I easily find a common language with the peasants, but I was interested in a simple and seemingly harmless question: which of the strangers have you met or seen in recent days near the forest and nearby? It is clear that I did not ask about it directly. As usual, I had to conspire. I talked to probably at least 50 people, mostly women, old people and teenagers. I think only 2 of them, former partisans, were really frank with me, the rest looked wary and said they didn't know anything. Dark people, downtrodden, the head of the police complained to me in Lida. Westerners, you know. You can't get words out of them. I heard such judgments more than once, and there was some truth in that. However, I understood these dark people well. Over the past 5 years, life here has changed dramatically 4 times. First, Senation, 11, Poland, then, accession to Soviet Belarus, then the war, it came here on the 2nd day, and the bloody German occupation, and finally, again, for the 2nd month, Soviet power. Moreover, in addition to official forces, there were very effective and illegal ones. During the occupation, partisans ruled in the forests, but now various gangs, residual groups of Germans, were prowling, and there were also small gangs of ordinary deserters. The actions of hostile illegal forces also had something in common: suddenness of appearance, cruelty, disregard for human lives. There were also their own characteristics. Akovtsi, arranging ambushes, fired on motor vehicles on the roads, killed primarily military personnel, got involved in battles even with small units of the Red Army. The Greens, gangs of Lithuanian nationalists, visiting from the north, cracked down on communists and village councillors, sometimes slaughtering entire families indiscriminately, robbing the peasants mercilessly. The Germans and Vlasovites were careful. They usually did not enter the villages, they attacked only in the forests, on back roads and on farms, without leaving, however, a single witness alive. They tried not to reveal themselves in order to avoid possible persecution and destruction. With all these terrible forces, the locals found themselves, as a rule, one-on-one. They were in constant fear of any stranger, expecting only violence, robbery or death from everyone, and not without reason believing that a short language was at least some guarantee of peace and personal security. My uniform hardly convinced them of anything, since our army uniforms were used by the Akovtsi, the Greens, the Vlasovites, and even the Germans. Local officials also sometimes tried to remain silent. A very typical conversation took place in Kamenka. The duties of the chairman of the village council there were performed by an old, big-nosed Belarusian peasant with a sparse faded mustache and a hand-rolled cigarette in his teeth. Sitting at a table in the middle of an empty dirty hut, he enthusiastically played checkers with a long-legged teenager, a messenger, and did not even hide his chagrin that they were interrupted. 3 old men, armed with German rifles, guarded the village council from the outside. They tumbled in after me and silently watched as the foreman checked my documents. Then, after trampling, they left with the boy. As in Shalovici, I introduced myself as a cantonment representative and presented, along with a travel order, not a red book with a frightening inscription, Smersh Counterintelligence, but an officer's identity card. The old man seemed to me simple-minded and talkative, but this is only at first sight. He really willingly spoke on various general topics, for example, about bread and high prices, about the lack of men or taxes, which he complained about 3 times, apparently fearing that I would ask for a cart. However, during our conversation, he managed not to name almost a single name. He did not say a word about the gangs, as if they did not exist. Meanwhile, I was imbued with the thought that it was precisely them that he feared most of all. He deftly avoided talking about those who collaborated and left with the Germans, but when asked about the Shalovici forest, he briefly remarked, "We don't go there," and started on something else. I had every minute on my account, and he talked at length, and I was forced to listen to how the children of his neighbor, playing, almost burned down the hut, or how a woman named Fiafina gave birth to twins in the spring. Moreover, the girl had white hair, and boys are black. Why would it be so? At the same time, he always smiled simply, good-naturedly and smoked with a ferocious self-garden. His face seemed to say, "Understand, you came and left, but I have to live here." After Kamenka, I looked at the farms that bordered the Shalovici Massif from the northwest. Solitary huts with outbuildings stretched along the forest at a considerable distance from each other, each in the middle of their vegetable gardens, groves and tiny fields. I went to everything where the owners were, but did not hear or see anything interesting for us. Kizniak was supposed to drive up at 2 o'clock and wait for me at the appointed place. At the beginning of the third, I headed for the highway, so that, leaving shoulder straps, a cap and documents in the car, I would go into the forest to inspect my site. I was hurrying through the hazel when I could make out the approaching footsteps behind me. I looked around, no one. I listened, someone was definitely catching up with me. Sliding the TT safety on the move, I put the pistol in my trouser pocket and, having chosen a suitable place, instantly hid behind a bush. Soon I saw someone who was hurrying after me. A black-haired, hunchbacked man, squat, frail, about 40 years old, in a tattered jacket and the same old trousers with large patches on the knees and behind, tucked into dirty boots, was walking quickly through the hazel, almost running. I talked with this peasant no more than an hour ago in his hut, where, besides him, at that moment there were 2 more women, as I understood it, his wife and mother-in-law. I noticed that before my arrival, something happened between them, a quarrel or a serious quarrel. All 3 of them showed some kind of anxiety or frustration on their faces. The women, especially the eldest, had reddish eyes with swollen eyelids and clearly tear-stained eyes. The hunchback himself looked with ill-concealed fear. He spoke in Polish, answered in monosyllables, quietly, repeating every now and then, "We don't understand. We don't know." 12. Now, having passed me, he took another 10 steps, stopped and listened, probably trying to determine where I had gone. Then he turned around, seeing me, shuddered in fright and said in confusion, "Good day, sir." "Good afternoon," I replied calmly, although we had already greeted him and, logically, we should have asked, "What do you need from me?" No doubt he ran after me. I watched expectantly. Beads of sweat glistened on his unshaven, flushed face, his bulging, ugly chest was breathing rapidly and excitedly. His rough boots up to the top of the tops were stained with dried manure. "Sir comrade," he began, looking around frightened, then fell silent and listened again. "Sir officer." He spoke Polish, excitedly, in a confused half-whisper. I did not understand a lot of things. I kept asking again, and in the 30 minutes of our conversation, with considerable difficulty, I understood the essence. As he talked, he kept looking around, or, making a sign to me, fell silent and listened intently. I asked twice about the cause of his anxiety, but both times he, probably not understanding, only shrugged his shoulders in bewilderment. After parting with him and making my way to the car, I pondered his story. What I was able to understand looked like this. Yesterday at dawn, he, Stanislav Svirid, looking for a cow that did not return to the house in the evening, saw 3 people in Soviet military uniforms near the edge of the Shalovichi forest. They passed in single file nearby, but he hid in a spruce forest and was not noticed. In the hall he recognized Pavlovsky Casimir. He saw the other 2 for the first time. According to Svirid, during the occupation, this Pavlovsky served the Germans somewhere near Warsaw, allegedly in the police, in some responsible position. Anyway, he got a lot of money. About big money, as it seemed to me, with a touch of envy, Svirid mentioned 3 times. Repeatedly Pavlovsky came to visit his father, who lived on a neighboring farm. He was always in civilian clothes and in a hat, but, as Svirid assured, he allegedly had an officer's rank and awards from the Germans. According to Svirid, Pavlovsky's father, a German by nationality, currently arrested, was in Lida, and his aunt lived in Kamenka. Actually, former policemen and all sorts of accomplices who did not have time to leave with the Germans roamed the forests in different gangs. They were dealt with by local bodies and mobile groups of troops of the NKVD, but they were of interest to us only to the extent that they posed a danger to the army and the rear of the front. There was something else about this story. The audience and the gangs gathered heterogeneous, dressed and armed in very different ways. Svirid, on the other hand, assured that these 3 were almost in the same uniform as our officers, and 2 of them probably had Soviet machine guns. And the second. When the Germans retreated, the policemen usually went with them to the west. Pavlovsky, who served somewhere near Warsaw, on the contrary, turned out to be for some reason 200 kilometers to the east, on this side of the front. How? At the same time, I understood that his presence near the Shalovichi Massif 13 hours before the wanted transmitter went on the air could also be pure coincidence. I was interested. What was Svirid so worried about, and why did he remain silent in his hut, and then, obviously, followed me, caught up and told me everything? Much regarding Pavlovsky still needed to be learned, checked and clarified both in Lida and here, on the spot, without delay. But now I could not lose even a minute. The forest was waiting for me. 7. Guard Lieutenant Blinov. An old oak caught his eye. A small hollow mysteriously blackened in a tree trunk about a meter above Andrei's head. For a few seconds he stood, thinking. What if? Jumping up, he grabbed the edge of the hollow, pulled himself up and, leaning the edges of his saws against the bark, stuck his hand in, dust, rotten dust. At the same moment, his leg slipped, and he fell down, almost breaking his arm and skinning his wrist until it bled. If in the morning this dull, unremarkable forest seemed to him special and significant, it seemed to be the very place from which the broadcast was conducted. If in the morning Andrei was full of confidence and hope, worried and waiting, then in the evening with every hour he believed less and less, that something can be found. In fact, is it easy to find traces of those who radioed among such an array, and why they should have inherited? This is not at all necessary. And then, how exactly is the exit point determined? Andrei knew that the actual position of the direction-finding radio would always be somewhat away from the presumably found one, and that errors in direction-finding could sometimes reach several kilometers. Most of all, he was oppressed by the feeling of his inferiority. If before being wounded, in the regiment on the front line, he was no worse than other platoon commanders, and sometimes better, then here, in the group, he was the weakest of the three in experience, skill and, of course, in terms of results. And no matter how hard he tried, in general, every time he turned out to be a dependent of Alekhine and Timantsev to one degree or another, and the thought of this constantly depressed him. When the sun sank to the horizon, he went east to reach the Shilovichi before dark, and soon wandered into a vast swamp covered with moss, rust and small alder. Maintaining the direction, he continued to move straight, but his legs sank deeper and deeper, rusty rotten water poured into the bootlegs. He painfully recalled the map. The swamp in this place did not seem to be listed, or he simply did not pay attention. The forest could be seen around at approximately the same distance. It was only necessary to decide how best to get out. He was looking around when he heard in the distance two short bursts of machine gun fire and immediately more single shots, and first of all he thought of Alekhine and Timantsev. Without wasting a second, he rushed to run to the right, in the direction where they were shooting, tearing his legs with difficulty and cursing both this swamp and his bad luck. As he walked, he listened all the time, expecting to hear the prearranged call signal, "Help is needed." However, silence reigned over the forest again. What happened there? Neither Alekhine nor Timantsev had machine guns with them. Who fired first? Who and in whom? Did Alekhine or Timantsev get caught like Bezos? Exhausted, he reached the outskirts of the swamp. The ground under his feet became harder, his boots sank only to the ankle. Behind a narrow strip of branched alder rose large trees. Hurriedly making his way through the bushes, Andrei jumped out into a tiny clearing overgrown with sedge, and to the left near the bushes he saw a spring gushing out of the ground, lined with black, as if charred snags, half gone into the ground. Kneeling by the barrel, he crouched down to the water and drank greedily, at the same time hastily washing his flushed face. The icy clear water tasted like a swamp and cruelly pinched his teeth. He straightened up on the snag, listening, and the next moment he froze in surprise. On the dark swampy ground, 3 steps away from him, he saw what he had been looking for all day and what he could only dream of: fresh prints of army boots, fresh, still unexploited. 8. Senior Lieutenant Timantsev. It was about 6, there was little time left before returning, and he decided to look at the abandoned tar mill, located to the south, some 2 kilometers away. He was drawn there from the very morning, probably because buildings standing separately in a forest or a desert place always attract. He could smell the stench from afar. When, guided mainly by the sun, he went out to the place where in previous years they smoked tar, the stench of decomposition became completely unbearable. Burying behind the bushes, he listened for several minutes and examined the clearing. the stream flowing through it and what was left of the tar mill. Log buildings to the right of it were destroyed and partially burned. The chimney of a half-collapsed tar-burning stove with the remains of a boiler embedded in it stuck out in the same place. All this was destroyed not now, when the front passed, but earlier. The remains of buildings and the stove had time to moss and overgrown with grass. To the left, closer to Timantsev, on a high, strong foundation stood a stone box of a one-story house without a roof and without rafters. His attention was drawn to empty window openings, or rather, sections of the wall adjacent to them from below and on the sides, densely dotted with gaps. That there had recently been a shootout here, he noted even earlier by the marks on the bushes and on the trunk of a tree. Judging by the withered twigs and leaves cut off by bullets, this happened 8 or 10 days ago. In the fetid silence, the brook murmured barely audibly, the soft singing of birds came from the forest, but Timantsev did not find any sounds or any signs of being here or near a person. Under the cover of the bushes, he crossed to the left, from where only 10 meters remained to the skeleton of the building, and in the corner, between the wall and the porch, he saw the bloated, disfigured corpse of a German. On the face of the corpse, or rather, on a light skull pecked to the bone, a large blue-black raven with a long curved beak sat motionless. Cheerful still life, nothing to say. Transferring the pistol from the back pocket of his trousers to the side pocket, Timantsev reached the porch with a jerk and ran up the steps. At his appearance, the vulture flew up in displeasure, and when he jumped into the building, dozens of crows darted through the windows with a loud croak. On the dark floor, among various rubbish, empty tin cans, pieces of plaster and countless scattering of spent submachine gun shells, 7 corpses lay in various poses, the Germans. All of them were without boots and without leather belts, with skulls and limbs pecked with crows, 2 without uniforms, and 1 without trousers, in dirty underpants. Hundreds of bluish flies swarmed over the carrion. In the neighboring, smaller room, there were 4 more corpses disfigured by decay and vultures near the windows. The rabble were Fritz, 1 in a dark tanker uniform with trousers loose, 6 in SS uniforms, the rest in a grayish mouse infantry uniform. According to thousands of cartridge cases, they completely covered the floor near the window openings. From the plaster chipped off on the walls and the location of the corpses one could imagine how it all happened. Having taken up all-round defense, they fired back fiercely, but they were all killed by machine gun fire and abandoned grenades here. Taking into account the heat and humidity of this place, as well as the color of the blood stains, Timantsev determined approximately the age of the corpses, 5 to 7 days, no less. From the unbearable stench, he literally suffocated and would have gladly run away into the forest, but, since he wandered here, he should have examined everything as it should be. In the first room, to the left, by the window, the corpses of 2 SS men, a large one and a small one, were stretched out side by side. And, fixing his gaze on the smaller one, Timantsev determined by the figure, a woman. She lay with her back up, in uniform SS trousers and an officer's uniform of the ROA, 13, without shoulder straps. He even spat out of contempt, and at the same instant, out of the corner of his eye, he caught how a branch of a bush stirred on the edge of the clearing opposite the window. He ducked headlong, immediately automatic bursts pierced the air above his head. Putting the barrel of his pistol over the window sill, he fired twice, without looking out, where the branch moved. In the next instant, he recoiled into a corner, behind a tiled stove, so that he had stone walls behind him and cover in front in case a grenade was thrown here. How many and who are they? By the sound, they were shooting from German machine guns. With 2 pistols and spare clips, it will cost them dearly. He expected to hear voices, shouts of commands, he expected an attack, but he only distinguished the rustle of steps, and those moving away. Obviously, there were few of them and they did not dare. He crawled between the corpses to the doorway, looked around and moments later was in the bushes on the opposite side. No one fired, and there was no rustle or sound at all. He waited at least a minute, then with a pistol at the ready, skirting the clearing, he crept to the place in the bushes from where he was shot at. Here, the grass was full of shells from PPSH, 14, not today's ones, which began to get dark, and he did not immediately find what he was interested in, and then separately 5 more fresh shells from a German machine gun. He continued to search, and farther into the forest he found drops of blood on the grass and on the leaves below. They were oval in shape with branches in the direction of movement of the person wounded by him. He hastily moved away from the clearing. Now he could definitely say, there were 2 shooters and they were armed with German machine guns. He wounded one, and they fled, no longer trying to kill or capture him. Most likely, he ran into some crazy, wandering Fritz or a Kovtsi. At first he decided to pursue and overtake them, but, glancing at his watch, he restrained himself. The sun had already descended to the horizon, it was quickly getting dark, and it was extremely difficult, almost impossible, to detect a small group or a single enemy in a dense forest with the onset of twilight. He was returning by the edge to the Shilovichi, pondering what had happened and mentally scolding himself. He couldn't hear them coming. It means that they approached there earlier, having heard his steps, hid, and he did not find them in time. Kulima. Dude. Hornless cattle. 9. Operational documents. Note on HF. Urgently. Polyakov on No, dated August 13, 44. 1. The operating wavelength of the transmitter wanted in the Neman case corresponds to one of the ranges of the Akovo radio communication. In addition, at the beginning of the second interception, 3 identical digital combinations are repeated, which, possibly, are deciphered as 999 or 555. The presence of these signs in front of the text during the radio communication of the AK, sheep, with the London Central, respectively, means, operational or, in the own hands of the Commander-in-Chief. 2. The Shilovichi forest area is located 140 kilometers west of the place where the walkie-talkie first went on the air. The movement of the transmitter corresponds to the direction of movement of the remaining groups of Germans, who are trying to get through the forests to the front line. Let me know if you took these circumstances into account when conducting search activities. Report on the progress of the search every day. Ustinov. Note on HF. Moscow, Ustinov No, dated August 14, 44. The circumstances to which you are drawing our attention have already been taken into account by us earlier, and all counterintelligence agencies of the front are oriented towards both versions. Polyakov. 10. Alekin Pavel Vasilievich. With the Major, head of the LIDA Department of State Security, I had my own, special relationship. Actually, according to the law, without an official request in each case, he did not have the right to give me any information. However, we helped him more than once, and not only with a car and gasoline, with which they were very bad. In turn, he tried in every possible way to meet us halfway. With the assistance of the Major, I intended to learn at least something about a number of people, including Pavlovsky and Svirid. And I also wanted to look at the investigation files of people arrested in the last days and weeks in that part of the district where the Shilovichi forest was located, and maybe talk to some of them. As luck would have it, at this late hour in the office, besides the Major himself, there was also his superiors, an unfamiliar lieutenant colonel from Baranovichi. I introduced myself and was forced to mention briefly that I was interested in Shilovichi and Kamenka. Hearing this, the lieutenant colonel got up and, pacing around the office, delivered a whole speech. Its meaning was that the Shilovichi Massif sits like a thorn in the territory of the region and that they do not have the strength and ability to clean up, or, as he put it, neutralize it. This is the business of the army, but, they say, this does not bother us at all, since the communications of the front pass to the side. As for the life of the region, the safety of local residents and authorities, we, they say, do not care about them. That's how it always is. The army considers us state security agencies, and the authorities consider us an army. He spoke loudly and with pathos, as if speaking on the podium. I got like chickens in cabbage soup. He addressed me as if I were, at least, the commander of the army and, if desired, it cost nothing for me to allocate the necessary forces, as I estimated, at least 3,000 people, to neutralize the Shilovichi forest. I could tell him a lot, but contradicting in such situations is a waste of time. Besides, I was dying to sleep. He was talking, and I was sitting on a stool in front of him, pretending to be listening attentively, and even nodding my head in agreement. In the same place, noticing the smile on the Major's face, I also smiled like a fool. Most of all, I was afraid that I would forget even for a moment, fall asleep and fall down. Finally he fell silent and, accompanied by the Major, went to rest. I followed them down the stairs, frantically concocting an excuse to call the Major aside and talk. Downstairs, apologizing to his superiors, he jumped into the office, where the duty officer was sitting, a ruddy mustachioed captain with the Order of the Red Banner on his tunic. I followed him in and, closing the door behind me, said bluntly that I needed to call the authorities on the HF a little later. "You will open an office for him," the Major ordered the officer on duty, hanging the key on the board. "And not in the service, but in friendship," I went on instantly. "Let me see the investigative files. Auntie, let me have a drink, otherwise I want to eat so much, there's nowhere to spend the night." Turning around, the Major noticed not without malice and ordered the duty officer, "Tell Sensila, let him show. Only punishers and accomplices. Excuse me, the authorities." Nodding in the direction of the door, he hurriedly shoved his hand into my hand. "Drop by tomorrow. Only punishers and accomplices. And thanks for that." I did not count on more. "Just a minute." Holding his hand, I unceremoniously blocked the road. "Do you know the hunchback Stanislav Svirid in Kamensky Farms? Dark-haired such, nervous." "I don't know," the Major said, pulling his hand out and walking around me. "And the surname did not meet. What about Pavlovsky?" "What? One is sitting with us. This is the senior." I myself was surprised at my perseverance. At the very exit I grabbed the Major from behind by the sleeve. "And the son? He has 2 sons. Having opened the door, the Major quickly stepped through the threshold and repeated from the corridor, "Drop in tomorrow." A little later, I was sitting in someone's empty, smoky office, and by the dim light of a kerosene lamp I looked through the investigation files of former elders, policemen and other accomplices of the Germans. The protocols contained very stereotyped questions and the answers of the persons under investigation were recorded in almost the same words. Most of them were arrested a few weeks ago. Nothing interesting for us. Absolutely. "Tell me, when and under what circumstances did you hand over to the Germans the family of partisan Joseph Tishkevich? List who else besides you participated in the mass executions of Soviet prisoners of war in Koshara in August 1941? During the search, gold items were found in your possession, rings, coins, used dental crowns. Tell us where, when and under what circumstances they came to you. It is clear that they fought for their lives, refused, denied. Pretty much the same, too. They were convicted by testimonies, confrontations, documents. Punishers, murderers, marauders, but what could they have to do with the radio we are looking for and in general with espionage? Why do we need them? Why am I wasting my time on them? But what if? It's what if always encourages when searching, generates hope and energy. But I was nodding and barely thinking. In order not to fall asleep, I tried to sing. I was enough for 1.5 or 2 verses. The case of Pavlovsky Sr. looked exactly the same as the others, a grayish folder, an arrest warrant, protocols of interrogations, and further unfiled working documents. He was arrested as a Volksdeutsch, for treason. However, what he did was criminal, except for signing the Volkslist and trying to leave with the Germans. I did not understand. And not only me. The protocols were followed by a piece of paper with a remark from the authorities. Tov. Zaitsev. The practical treacherous activity of P has not been revealed. It is necessary to identify and document it. Among other things, Pavlovsky was asked the question about his sons, to which he replied. My sons, Kazimir and Nikolai, really served with the Germans on the territory of Poland in construction organizations, in which ones I don't know. I don't know any details of their service with the Germans. Like this. In construction organizations. And Svirid assured me that he was in the police. In a responsible position. Actually, the policeman and other accomplices were of little interest to us. However, I was interested. What did Kazimir Pavlovsky and two with him do on the day of the radio session near the Shalovichi forest? How did he get there? And why are all three of them equipped in the same way, in our supposedly officer uniforms? In order to climb forests, this is not necessary, moreover, it is dangerous. However, I admitted that with regard to their appearance, the details of their appearance, sphered, out of fright, could confuse. 10 minutes later, sitting at the HF apparatus in the office of the head of the department, I waited to be connected to Lieutenant Colonel Polyakov. I called to report on the progress of the search and in the secret hope that the directorate had already received the text of the decryption or, maybe, some new information about the transmitter with the call signs of KAO and about the wanted ones. Such hope is always in you. And not from dependency. No matter how successful things are, you never forget that the group is not alone, that people work for you, and not only in the office. Someone, but Polyakov, will not fail to see to it that everything possible is done everywhere, including in Moscow. Finally, a quiet, slightly burry voice of the lieutenant colonel was heard in the receiver, and I quite clearly imagined him, short, with a convex, bumpy forehead and slightly protruding ears, in a tunic with crumpled field epaulets, sitting on him loosely, baggy. I imagined how, listening to me, he, sitting sideways in an armchair, would begin to make notes on a piece of paper and at the same time, out of habit, would quietly sniff his nose from time to time, somehow childishly and kind of offended. I began to report on the progress of the search, told about the footprints at the spring and about how Timantsev was fired upon, about conversations with Vasyukov and Svirid. There was nothing significant in all this, but he listened to me without interrupting, only occasionally agreed, clarified, and I already understood, they have nothing new. What did Pavlovsky and two with him on the day of the radio session near the Shalovichi forest? This is a question. When I stopped, he said. How did you get there? So. Pavlovsky Kazimir, or Kazimierz, Georgievich, born in 1917 or 18, a native of the city of Minsk, inaccurate, according to the documents, presumably a Belarusian or a Pole. Yes, sparsely. Let's check all the materials search. Now, Pavel Vasilyevich, regarding the text. The general has just talked to Moscow. There is no decryption yet. And ours are still fighting without result. But I hope that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow the text will be. In the meantime, squeeze the forest. 11. In the forest near the spring. Kizniak woke them up in the dark. Having had a quick breakfast, they were already in the forest before the sun. Everything around was still asleep in the pre-dawn dream. They walked along a narrow path, leaving dark streaks of footprints on the grass, silvery white with dew. Timantsev looked around with displeasure. However, the day promised to be hot, the dew will come down, and the striped traces will disappear. In the meantime, the air is cool and full of fragrant freshness. To walk like this light and walk. Andrei painfully wanted to speak. After all, soon you will have to disperse and spend the whole day alone. But you can only talk about the case, and what to say to him, and even then in a whisper. The forest does not like noise, Alekhin remarked more than once. Half an hour later, Andrei led them to the spring. On the other side of the snags, on the dark swampy ground, under a bush, as yesterday, the footprints of boots were clearly visible. Balancing on a long, curved log, Timantsev and Alekhin squatted down and examined the tracks, pulling a thread with multicolored knots out of his pocket. Timantsev measured the length of the print, the length and width of the sole and heel. Then, after licking his finger, he put it on the track. The earth almost did not stick. For about a minute he looked at the prints and touched them, carefully touching the edges with strong fingers. German officer's boot. Mass tailoring, he finally said, straightening up. The size corresponds to our 42. Little worn, one might say, new. Individual where defects are not yet expressed. The trail is relatively fresh, no more than 2 days old. The imprint is random, the one who drank stumbled or slipped off the driftwood and inherited it. This is a tall man, 175, 180 centimeters. There is someone in the forest, Andrei whispered, unable to stand it. After the shell shock, he stuttered, especially in moments of excitement. Subtle vital observation. Timantsev snorted and, after a pause, continued, perhaps he was not alone. The grass does not leave traces, but here they probably stepped on snags. And if one had not inherited, then nothing would have been left. The R-spring is not S-heard and is not visible from the Deer Road, Andrei whispered, turning to Alekine. He really wanted the traces he discovered to be effective and useful in the search. Therefore, only people who know the forest or been here could get in here. And also the one who has the map, Timantsev added instantly. The spring is definitely marked. To Andrei's chagrin, he was right. For several minutes, the three of them climbed in the wet thick grass, examined the bushes and trees around the spring. Monkey work. Timantsev spat, looking at the footprints with dislike. Here's another fact for you. Which also does not give or explain anything. Need text. He said with conviction. And without the text we will stick around like blind puppies. The text should be announced today or tomorrow, Alekine said. The text will be. He assured. In the meantime, we must find an exit point and establish who was in this forest the day before yesterday. Must. Timantsev chuckled. We may collect traces, but people. Who are they? He asked, pointing to the prince. Agents, paratroopers? Not at all. In 3 years I have not seen a single one wearing brand new German army boots. Maybe it's a Kovtsi? Or the Germans? Or maybe just deserters? Deserters with a radio? Andrei protested. Who said they have a walkie-talkie? Timantsev inquired coldly, turning to no one. Personally, this trail says nothing to me. This is the imprint of a German boot. All in all. And no more. 12, Timantsev. Life is a damn tricky thing. Occasionally she smiles, but more often she turns her back and shows her character. Oddly enough, on this day she smiled at us. For about an hour we examined the forest in the vicinity of the spring. In one place, on the road, Pasha made out vague footprints. In the grass, on clayey damp ground, 6 footprints were discernible. They turned out to be identical with those found near the spring and of the same age. And here and there were traces of the same person. Obviously, having drunk, he went towards Kamenka or to the tar mill, so we assumed, looking at the map. It is possible that it was one of those who fired at me there yesterday. But here he seemed to be alone. Judging by the footprints, he walked at a business pace, at a speed of 5 or 6 kilometers per hour. Pasha decided to follow in the direction of his movement to the edge of the forest or even to Kamenka. Parting, I told him again that we needed a decryption text. He winced, but said nothing. Blinov and I went to our sites. We parted, not suspecting that a few hours later life would smile at us, and how, in 32 teeth. I don't even know what pulled me to turn onto that deaf path. It is difficult to say what works in such cases, intuition or upper instinct. 15. The path was like a path overgrown with grass, and I kept looking intensely at my feet. Like yesterday, the German anti-personnel mine with a push or pull fuse most of all worried my body. It's amazing how I noticed her in the tall thick grass. No, not a mine, but an ordinary chamomile with a recently broken off head, drooping on a stalk about 30 centimeters above the ground. Having hit it on the way, the beast could probably have damaged it, but I nevertheless turned there, especially since I could make out a faint gap in the bushes. Didn't even take 10 steps, a clearing. He began to examine it and saw crushed grass under a hazel tree, a square the size of a cape. I tensed all over, probably, such sensations a dog has when he makes a rack. I began to search everything sequentially, rummaging, spreading the grass and branches with my hands, and about 20 minutes later, behind the bushes, I found a cucumber, fresh. And bitten. I cut off a piece, chewed it and immediately spat it out, bitter. Therefore, he was thrown out. Long live bitter cucumbers. Long live traces and evidence. Throwing off my boots and trousers so as not to turn green, and putting the pistols behind the belt of my tunic, I divided the clearing into sectors, and for more than 2 hours, span by span, crawled all over it on all fours and the bushes under the trees, along the edges. I rubbed my knees, and managed to peel off the left one, but the sweat was not in vain. In the tall thick grass, beyond the edge of the clearing, I found a second cucumber, also bitten and, as I was immediately convinced, bitter, and behind a bush, near a bruise, a burnt match, fresh. And the remains of scattered ashes, barely visible in the grass. This excited me the most. There were no traces of a fire nearby, obviously. They lit a cigarette or something was set on fire from a match. Maybe they destroyed the sheets of the encryption notebook. The ashes turned out to be the size of a gulkin's nose, but I was still able to determine that he was, alas, not from paper, but tobacco, from cigarettes or cigarettes. Expensively I would now give for that very cigarette, but although everything around was examined, I began to search the clearing again. 13. Guard Lieutenant Blinov. Ahead, behind the bushes, he saw the dilapidated roofs of some kind of buildings, a long thin crane, and realized that in front of him was one of the farms and that he had reached the edge of the forest earlier than he should have. Thirst tormented him. He went to the farm, deciding to get drunk, and then return to the forest for an hour. He was making his way through the bushes, when suddenly there, by the buildings, a dog barked hoarsely, and through the branches, almost simultaneously, Andrei made out an old hut, and a little to the right and further, about 200 meters from him, he saw 2 military men approaching the farm from the opposite side. He watched them for a few moments, managed to notice a duffel bag over the shoulders of one, and immediately the corner of the hut hid them. Andrei hurried, turning a little to the right, so that, without revealing himself, he would be on the other side of the hut, where voices were already heard. Someone shouted at the dog twice, but she, without stopping, barked and drowned out the words. Guided by the mossy roof and the tall crane, he advanced further and stopped. I did not dare to come closer. The dog could smell it, and began to look out for a place for observation. He chose a gnarled oak with a thick trunk and a dense spreading crown. Tall bushes came close to the tree, surrounding it below, like chickens laying hens. Having got close to the oak tree by the hazel tree, Andrei climbed up the tree without noise and clung to one of the gaps in the foliage. The military men, throwing off their tunics and identical faded blue t-shirts, poured water at the well, in front of the hut. Judging by the uniforms, they were officers, but in what ranks, Andrei could not make out from afar. He looked around for a duffel bag, but did not find it. It must have been carried into the hut. Andrei immediately saw the owner, a frail, nondescript man, barefoot, in dark gray trousers and a shirt without a belt. With a jar in his hand, he emerged from the cellar and, walking across the yard to the hut, shouted at the dog, which, however, had no effect on it. The senior officer was of medium height, perhaps 40 years old, a heavily built man with an elongated nose on a conspicuous, completely round face and somewhat short legs. The younger one is a young man, a little taller, thin, looking about 20, with blonde, combed-back hair. They splashed water in their faces with noticeable pleasure, rubbed their necks and shoulders, talking quietly about something. Andrei did not make out a single word. The dog, a tall, curly-haired dog, chained by the kennel, near the barn, barked from time to time, but without the former malice, and so, out of duty. Once again the owner appeared, went into the barn and soon returned, carrying a bowl of eggs. The officers followed him into the hut, and Andrei began to examine the farm. A squat, run-down hut with a half-rotten shingled roof, a rather low door, and 3 small windows on the front side. Nearby were, a cellar with a sagging cellar, a log barn, a barn with a lopsided gate, and behind it a dozen stunted apple trees. Both the buildings and the fence were pretty dark with age, the roofs were full of holes, everything looked deserted and unattractive. To the right, about 300 meters, behind the trees, one could still see a farm, from where the officers seemed to have appeared. Who are they? Why did they come? What kind of relationship do they have with the owner? Andrei thought. In the appearance of the officers, in their behavior, there was, perhaps, nothing that could clarify these issues. A good half-hour passed. No one left the hut, and he was still sitting on the tree. From the neighboring farm came soft singing, a mournfully pitiful girl's voice. You are May Pirapelka. Thirst tormented him, his arms and legs were completely numb. Wishing to change his position, he stepped over with his foot, the rotten bough broke off, and Andrei almost fell over. He barely managed to grab hold of the branch above his head, numb, trembling from long exertion. He immediately froze, but the dog heard a crack and burst into a hoarse, furious bark. She did not stop and was torn on the chain in the direction where Andrei was sitting on the tree, even when the owner came out. He said something to her, but she continued to bark and tear. Only then Andrei realized that the wind was pulling from him to the hut, that the dog had sensed a stranger and now would not calm down. Not enough to be discovered. He saw the owner bend down at the kennel, perhaps about to unlock the chain. Andrei literally fell off the tree and rushed to the edge of the Shalovichi. 14, Tamantsev. I spent another hour or so trying to find the cigarette butt, but without success. I could definitely say that not so long ago, apparently the day before yesterday, 2 or 3 people had been here, sitting, smoking and eating. Moreover, these are shot sparrows and very cautious. At the place of stay, they did not leave a piece of paper, or a cigarette butt, or traces of food. Cucumbers that turned out to be inedible are thrown far away, over the edge of the clearing, and a charred match is thrust into thick moss behind a bush. It is almost impossible to detect them without a thorough search. Such foresight reinforced me in the idea that those who were here tried not to inherit, and moreover, gave rise to the hope that I stumbled upon the place where the radio went on the air. Although from this clearing to the Triangle of Errors, 16, determined during direction finding by tracking stations, it was not less than a kilometer. As usual, I tried to simulate the actions of these people and turned the walkie-talkie, assuming that the transmitter was located where the grass was flattened. Throwing off my boots again, I climbed the trees on the edge of the clearing, to the west and northwest of this place, examining the branches with special attention from the bottom to the very top, but with all my diligence I did not find any traces of the antenna being thrown. What if my assumptions are wrong and those who were here the day before yesterday did not have any walkie-talkies with them? I stood barefoot in the middle of the clearing, prompting my convolutions to increased brain activity. I understood that you couldn't sew a fur coat out of cucumbers, matches and bruises on the grass. So far, all this is facts in the world of the galaxy. And it is great and infinite. In thought, I fixed my gaze on 2 tall hazelnuts and an oak tree 15 paces from the bruise. I did not climb them, they would not have survived, and they grew away from the antenna, spread out by me. Not without difficulty, bending down, I began to inspect them in turn, and on the second hazel, at a height of 4 meters, in the deepening of the fork of the 2 upper branches, I saw what I was looking for: damage to the bark, a fresh trace, like propylene. They threw a wire antenna with a weight and then pulled together. In such a huge wilderness with the forces of only 3 people, to find on the second day the place where the walkie-talkie went on the air is like spotting a needle in a haystack. Or win 100,000 on a lottery ticket. Mentally I applauded myself. For joy I wanted to slap my thighs and shout, I am the greatest. Emotions are emotions, but business is business. Taking out one of the calls, I adjusted myself and, imitating the voice of a female hazel grouse, whistled, "Tuuti. Tuuti. Tuuti." After waiting for half a minute, he repeated the call, and immediately in the distance, the response cries of the male were heard, "Tttuti. Tttuti." Our conditional signals meant approximately, "Your presence is desirable, I'm coming." Having accepted my call, the captain was already moving towards me through the forest. Judging by the sound, he was about a kilometer away from me. As he walked, I kept looking. Under the bushes, at the exit to the path, I saw grains of shag and crushed pepper on the ground, traces were sprinkled, and again noted the caution and foresight of the people who had been here. I crawled on all fours in the tufted grass, picking out grains. From time to time I gave the decoy signals so that the captain could clarify the direction of movement on the move. Before Pasha, to my pleasure, real hazel grouses appeared, an old and 2 young cockerels, all right, with beautiful ash-gray tails. Flying from tree to tree, they reached the edge of the clearing and, finding a man, instantly disappeared. Pasha did not even try to hide his joy. Without saying a word, I showed him the bruise, the match, and the cucumbers, and then bent down the hazel. He saw a cut on the bark and could not resist. He hugged me. This was not the case for him, and I appreciated it. Well, what's next? I asked in a whisper. We searched all around, climbed the bushes and all the paths within a radius of at least 500 meters, but found nothing else. It was as if those who broadcast did not then step on the ground, but rose into the air or disappeared altogether. Theoretically, it is allegedly impossible not to inherit, but this is only theoretically. I knew that tonight in Moscow it would become known that in such and such a forest area, large and impassable, this will certainly be noted, we found a place for the radio to go on the air, and my name must be mentioned in the message. It's nice, of course, but what's next? In fact, there were about a dozen questions that we would now have to answer. However, we could not say anything definite about 3 of them, perhaps the main ones. Where did the broadcasters come from and how did they leave? How many people were there, 2 or 3, and, most importantly, who were they? Where and who could see them on the outskirts of the forest? Tired and hungry, we silently returned in the evening to the Shalovichi. We were clean before the authorities and before Moscow, like angels. But for the time being, this is of no use. Shish and Kumish. 15, we'll have to install them. Before reaching the Shalovichi, Andrei turned left from the edge, where a light smoke was rising above the grove. Soon, through the bushes, he made out a secluded clearing, a blackened cauldron over the fire, and the hefty figure of Kizniak with a ladle in his hand. Clean aluminum bowls stood ready on the grass near the fire. Neither Alekhine nor Timantsev had yet been, and Andrei was very upset by this. Leaving the farm, he hurried here to inform about the officers, and then, as he hoped, everything would be done at the discretion of Alekhine or Timantsev. Andrei himself, with all his desire, could not determine to what extent these officers were of interest and whether they should be dealt with. However, Alekhine and Timantsev had not yet returned, and it turned out awkwardly. Taking binoculars in the car, Andrei went out to the floor in the bushes and lay down under a hazel tree. Directly in front of him was an unsown field in a wide strip, the highway was visible to the right, the edge of the forest to the left. Cars loaded with ammunition, crates and sacks of groceries passed along the highway from time to time. A blunt tractor was slowly towing a bulky artillery piece. Then, from the direction of Lida, a rifle regiment stretched to the northwest. Lying under a bush, Andrei looked through binoculars at the soldiers moving along the highway. In full combat gear, hung with machine guns, small sapper shovels, waste bags and with duffel bags on their backs, they marched company after company, in columns of 4, measuredly and unhurriedly. Will they be somewhere in a week? Behind Mariampol, near Syalai, or maybe near Suwalki. Andrei remembered his native guards regiment, in which he fought for about a year and where he knew almost all the officers, many sergeants, soldiers. I remembered the soldiers of his, Andrei, platoon. Where are they now? Now to go and go. To the west. And here? Search and collect cigarette butts. A dreary sadness took possession of Andrei. The last wagon of the regimental convoy disappeared around the corner, and the highway was empty for a while, and Andrei lay in a sad stupor, lowering his binoculars and fixing his eyes on the distance. He woke up, hearing the voices of Alekhine and Timantsev in the clearing, and looked around. Timantsev approached the fire with a quick elastic gait so easily and cheerfully, as if he had slept all day somewhere nearby and, having just woken up, hurried to dinner. Andrei thought that Timantsev, now or after dinner, would definitely train for at least half an hour in forceful detention, in swinging the pendulum, in various jumps, feints and dashes. He would work out souplesse until the third sweat, 17, and Andrei felt with special force his inferiority. I had to get up and go. Freeing his numb hand, Andrei rolled onto his side and at the same time involuntarily looked to the left. 200 paces from Andrei were walking across the field from the forest to the highway. Andrei automatically raised the binoculars to his eyes and froze in surprise, and the next moment he moved back behind the hazel. These were the same officers whom he had seen an hour ago on a farm near the edge of the forest. And, he noticed it right away, they did not have a duffel bag. Comrade C. Captain, over here. Turning around, Andrei called excitedly. Be faster. Alekin came up and, taking the binoculars held out to him, stood behind a bush near Andrei. Timantsev was immediately there. Officers with folded raincoats in their hands walked across the field, talking about something. Andrei hurriedly told how he saw them on the farm, how the dog barked and he was forced to retreat. 3 times he mentioned the knapsack. Who approaches the dog from the leeward side? Kolyoma. Timantsev spat. They will go out to the highway and vote for the development of motor transport, he suggested, stepping between the hazelnuts and carefully deflecting the branch with his hand. At that moment, the stocky captain walking to the right turned his round face towards the village, and Alekin through binoculars, and Timantsev, with their far-sighted eyes, could see him. I think I saw him in Lida, Alekin said uncertainly. Never see them again. Timantsev said with feeling. I want to eat, you know, eat. And now you have to install them. He was right. Alekin silently looked through the binoculars. The officers were already about 50 meters from the highway. What to think something? Timantsev exclaimed impatiently and with displeasure, flaring his nostrils. We must follow them. Coming to the highway, the officers jumped over the ditch and stood on the side of the road closest to the scouts, apparently intending to stop the passing car. Watching them through binoculars, Alekin was silent for a few more seconds. To the car. He finally ordered. Let's go. Timantsev and Andrei rushed through the bushes to the lorry. Kizniak, not suspecting anything, with a ladle in his hand, stood by the fire and purred something under his breath. Done, he said without turning around. Motors. Timantsev commanded. We're leaving. Throwing back the tailgate, he and Andrei hurriedly threw things into the body. Kizniak looked for some time without understanding, then ran up to the car, started the engine and, quickly returning, stood by the fire in confusion. Timantsev, pushing him away, seized the cauldron and with a decisive movement poured all the fat, smoking zittel onto the fire. Bouillon. To hell. Timantsev cursed, filling the fire with water. In places. Slipping between the bushes, he rushed to the floor. After half a minute he ran out and told Andrei. They got into the car. Zis I-72-15. Alekin jumped out of the hazel tree behind him. Timantsev and Andrei, as if on command, climbed into the body at once. Stay. The captain ordered Timantsev. Look at the footprints, there should be good prints on the arable land. Communication in the city through the commandant. He jumped into the cab, shouting to Kizniak. To Lida. 16, operational documents. Note on HF. Urgently, Igorov. Special message. Today, August 15, 44, at dawn, the operational military group of the counterintelligence department of the army secretly surrounded the Zaleski farm, 18 kilometers northwest of the city of Lida, in order to seize the underground radio station AK and arrest the keepers of the transmitter, Svidkovsky Vitold and Yenina, identified by us liaising with the Ragnar detachment. When our officers appeared, under the pretext of buying milk, the Svidkovskys, together with the third member of the Akiv, Yosef Nowak, who allegedly belonged to the same terrorist, so-called liquidation group, locked themselves in the house, destroying incriminating evidence, and then put up fierce resistance. As a result, Svidkovskaya and Novak were killed, and Sviatkovsky blew himself up with a bunch of anti-tank grenades. In the ruins of the house were found 2 badly damaged and burnt radios, an English-made apparatus of the AP-4 type, manufactured in 1943, and a shortwave receiver of the KS-1 type. In a broken mirror cache, old code tables and 2 unopened operational logs were found to record communication data, call signs, waves, audibility, and the number of received and transmitted correspondence. Sviatkovsky and Novak managed to destroy most of the documents. Collecting whole ashes to restore the text was not possible. During excavations near the back wall of the barn, a cache was discovered, from which we seized a box with radio components and spare batteries for radios and 3 sets of Soviet military uniforms. One of them was for officers, with blood stains on the chest and on the right shoulder. According to the verified data we have, on August 12 and 13 the Sviatkovskys were absent, and their house was empty. It is possible that the Sviatkovskys were on August 13 at the hour of the radio session of the transmitter with the call sign KAO in the area of the Shilovichsky forest, located in the zone of operations of the Ragnar detachment, just 30 kilometers from their home farm Zaleski. Pontryagen. Note on HF. Pontryagen. Take all measures to establish where the Sviatkovskys were on August 13 and 7 this year. In the afternoon. Of particular interest to us are the details of the radio cipher they may have used, as well as the mode and any details of the radio transmission. Igorov. 17, Toledo. When Kizniak drove out onto the highway, the 3-ton VMS, on which 2 officers sat, had already disappeared from sight. The arrow on the speedometer of the lorry was trembling between the numbers 40 and 50. The speed for a cobblestone coating is considerable, but, as it now seemed to Andrei, still insufficient. Alekin leaned back in the corner of the cabin and, wrapping a handkerchief around the binoculars, pressed it to his eyes. At the next Vesca, he was able to clearly see the ZIS that was driving far ahead. It was a battered 3-ton with the number I-1-72-15 faintly visible on the back side. In addition to the young officer, the chubby captain got into the cab. There were 7 civilians in the back of the car, judging by the clothes, peasants, and 2 soldiers. A piece of the tailgate on the left side at the top was broken. Remarkable car. Soon, the ZIS stopped at one of the villages. One could see how the peasants removed the bags from the car, and then, crowding around the cab, paid the driver. Kizniak, in order to keep his distance, was forced to slow down, and immediately a column of Studebakers, about a dozen cars, overtook the gas truck and drove ahead of him. This did not suit the scouts in any way. Between a lorry and a ZIS with a broken side there should have been, for cover, no more than 2 or 3 cars. Overtake. Alekin ordered. Kizniak overtook several trucks in turn. In front of the jeep now rolled a short-haired jeep. Kizniak signaled 3 times to take the right, but the driver of the jeep continued to drive as he drove. Lined with trees on both sides, the road was rather narrow, which made it difficult to overtake, and in this position made it completely impossible. And yet, having chosen a convenient moment, Kizniak, in violation of all the rules, went overtaking on the right side and caught up with the jeep. For a moment the cars sped side by side. A mustachioed tank major sitting next to the driver shouted something indignantly and threatened Kizniak with his fist. Kizniak paid no attention to this, but the jeep jumped ahead, and the driver, apparently on the orders of the major, without giving way, again rolled along the very middle. Through the rear window of the cockpit Andrei saw how Kizniak, excitedly waving his hand, said something to Alekin. Like most experienced drivers, Kizniak did not tolerate fast driving, much less racing on rough roads. Usually calm and somewhat phlegmatic, on such occasions he would get angry and lose his temper and curse at what the world was worth. Lida was 4 kilometers away. Ahead, at the crossing, a roadrunner, a squat woman in a faded cotton shawl and old boots, lowered a striped barrier. Willis rushed and slipped under the crossbar, which kept falling. Kizniak and Alekin shouted from the cockpit in one voice. The woman turned around. She had a red, with very light eyebrows, sleepy face. Alekin shot out of the car like a bullet, tearing the rope from it, pushed the barrier up, and under the deafening alarming whistle of the locomotive, the lorry, bouncing on the rails, jumped over the canvas. Far ahead, the outskirts of Lida, illuminated by the dim evening sun, were visible. Kizniak quickly overtook the jeep and honked again. A small, curvy car, still unhurried, stubbornly drove along the very middle. The road became wider, and Kizniak, having made up his mind, unexpectedly sharply increased speed and along the very side of the road, almost falling into a ditch, tightly bypassed the jeep. Now nothing interfered with him, and he drove with might and main. Trucks raced in front of the lorry. ZISI 1-72-15 was visible from time to time in front of them. In the back, on a bench near the cockpit, a young blonde-haired officer was sitting in profile to the scouts. At the checkpoint at the entrance to the city, on both sides of the barrier, 2 or 3 cars accumulated. The female traffic controllers checked the driver's travel documents and let the cars pass in turn from one side or the other. The lorry stopped. There were 6 trucks between it and the ZIS with a broken side. Kizniak immediately got out and walked around the lorry, examining and tapping the cylinders with his foot. Alekin jumped down to the side of the road and looked at what was going on ahead. A mustachioed major got out of the jeep that drove up with a menacing look. He was still young, about 26. Patting himself on the top of his chrome boot with a cane, he called out imperiously and impatiently to Kizniak. "Sergeant, come to me." Kizniak looked inquiringly at Alekin. "Get behind the wheel," Alekin ordered, and Kizniak, ducking his head, squeezed into the cab. "Captain, come here." All red with rage, cried the major. Alekin came up and saluted. "But how dare you," the major said breathlessly, "to overtake a passenger car, of a senior in rank?" Alekin silently took out and showed him his service certificate, or rather, the cover with the embossed inscription, Smersh Counterintelligence. "But I didn't know," the major said in bewilderment. "Believe me, comrade captain, I didn't know. And you have nothing to know," Alekin remarked in an undertone. "There are traffic rules that are mandatory for everyone, and they must be observed." Having trumped, he went ahead and caught up with a lorry. The cars slowly moved one after another to the barrier. "They will leave, comrade captain." Andrew couldn't resist. "Do not get up in the back," Alekin ordered him and quickly went to the wooden checkpoint booth. He knew that by the time the 6 front trucks were checked, the ZIS would be far away. Andrei saw Alekin enter the open door. After some seconds, the driver of the ZIS, whom they were following, checked the documents, and the car started off from the barrier. "Turn left," Andrei ordered Kizniak. Live. Kizniak drove to the left and managed to dash through to the barrier, but the oncoming car was already moving, and he was forced to slow down, having managed, however, at the last moment to turn right so that the lorry became oblique, blocking the road. The traffic sergeant with a tanned, ugly face, waving her flag, rushed to the lorry. Where are you going?" she shouted in a hoarse voice. Both in front and behind furiously honked. Abusive cries of indignant drivers were heard. Kizniak, opening the door ajar, stepped on the footboard and, without removing his hand from the crosspiece of the steering wheel, leaned out of the cab, looking around. At this critical moment, Timantsev appeared. He had just pulled up in a passing car. Without asking anything, he ran around the lorry and rushed to the oncoming car. "Back! Back down!" Making a fierce face, he yelled at the driver in a loud voice and brazenly introduced himself, "Military Traffic Inspector." "What are you doing?" "Back down." The pockmarked foreman, the driver of the oncoming ZIS, somewhat dumbfounded by such an onslaught, began to make excuses, but Timantsev, opening the cab door, resolutely pushed him aside and, jumping behind the wheel himself, quickly rolled the car back and to the right, to the very ditch. Meanwhile, the traffic controller, standing in front of the lorry, scolded Kizniak, the undoubted culprit of the traffic jam, who, moreover, did not want to push him back, over the side of the road, to the arrest area, as she demanded. "Do not be noisy. I don't have reverse gear. You see, no." Kizniak swore in an imploring bass, wiping the sweat from his face with a dirty rag. Well, do not yell. Let's part now. And why are you being taken to the war? Ugh, devil. He spat in his heart. Alekine and the massive, angry head of the checkpoint were already hurrying from the wooden booth to the barrier. Let them go. Chewing on the go, she shouted to the traffic controller. Drive to the turn and, almost without slowing down, turn to the right, where the ZIS disappeared. It was a matter of 1 minute for Kizniak, but ahead, not a single car was visible ahead. Directly. Alekine ordered. A lorry swept down the street for several blocks, and then at one of the intersections, on a parallel street, a VMS with military men in the back flashed by. Kizniak slowed down so that Andrei and Timantsev were pressed hard against the front side, and immediately began to turn back, but Timantsev, leaning into the cockpit, shouted. It's not the same car. The lorry stopped. Alekine climbed out onto the footboard, sweat glistening on his forehead. Let's turn to the left, Andrei advised hesitantly. Let's jump back, past the bazaar and to the S station. Our army boots, Timantsev said to Alekine, sizes 41 and 42, mass-made, wide lasts. Worn, with pronounced individual characteristics. With those prints that the spring, of course, nothing similar. But you still have to install them, referring to the officers, he noted. They will demand from us. As for the car, I believe that the VMS from the frontline food warehouse. You know, there are fenced stacks near the station? And I think so, Zizek, from the food warehouse. Kizniak stood up not quite confidently. Why were you silent before? I can't handle it. And you need people, not a car, said Kizniak understandingly. Maybe they'll come down, and then turn around. To the warehouse. 18, at the front warehouse. As soon as the car drove up to the territory of the warehouse, Timantsev on the move rolled over the side and, while Alekine, getting out of the car, was explaining himself to the sentry at the entrance, slipped through the gate. On a large level area, under tarpaulins, piles of boxes, barrels and bags, various products were stacked. Everyone around was in motion, drivers and storekeepers, this restless semi-combatant people, more than anyone full of awareness of their significance and necessity in the war, recipients from units and soldiers in flour-stained tunics, who dragged boxes and bags onto scales, loaded them into trucks. In the right corner, near the barbed wire fence, an anti-aircraft gun was staring at the sky with hostile alertness. Near the stack of sacks of flour, at the line of cars waiting in line for loading, Alekine found the head of the warehouse, an elderly major, stout, with a large protruding belly, but extremely agile and energetic. Having learned that Alekine was from counterintelligence, he, leaving his affairs, led him into a spacious dugout where the headquarters of the warehouse was located, asked 2 sergeant clerks to leave, and only then, sitting down himself and seating Alekine, asked him what interests him. ZISI 1-72-15 is your car? And 1-72-15? Mine. And what happened? So far, nothing, Alekine reassured. She has just returned from Alatus, obviously, from Mariumpol or Kaunas. She still has a piece of the side broken off at the back. The car went to Mariumpol. Which one, I can't say for sure. And I don't know about the board, my deputy is in charge of transport. We'll find out now, the major promised and got up. Do you know the driver? And 1-72-15. Boris Kin. Frankly speaking, I know him a little. He has been with us recently, about 2 months. But I can't say anything bad. The driver is like a driver. I would like to talk to him. And look at the personnel register. Just so that there is no noise, Alekine asked. Clear. Coming out of the dugout, the major said something to one of the clerks, then returned and, as was customary in the army, asking Alekine if he wanted to eat, silently began to rummage through the old office cupboard. He, apparently, was not curious, did not ask unnecessary questions. In all his actions one could feel a calm efficiency, and Alekine could not but appreciate this. There was a knock on the door. Enter. Comrade Major, Corporal Boris Kin arrived at your order. Alekine saw in front of him a short, thin blonde man with dark cunning eyes in a pale, unwashed face. Boriskin was wearing dirty, oiled trousers and a tunic with soldier's shoulder straps, and on his feet were old chrome boots with reddish shank. He quickly shifted his gaze from the major to the unfamiliar captain and, apparently not expecting anything good for himself, immediately became alert. "Sit down," said the major. "Nothing, let's wait." Boriskin looked quickly at Alekhin again. "When did you break the board?" "This was last night at the unloading." "I am not guilty." Studer turned around in reverse and crashed. "And I have nothing to do with it." I reported the pomp. "Okay. I'll check. The captain wants to talk to you." The major nodded in the direction of Alekhin. "It's about what?" Boriskin narrowed his eyes. "You'll find out," said the major, and leaning towards Alekhin's ear, he asked in a whisper, "Should I leave?" "Why?" "Stay." "Sit down, Corporal," Alekhin suggested, and Boriskin sat down on a stool 3 steps from the table. Alekhin asked him as casually as possible several general questions: where he came from, which of his relatives he had, how long he had been in the army, whether he was satisfied with his service in the unit, how much he had to travel, where and with what load. Boriskin answered slowly and rather succinctly, considering every word with a kind of alertness and avoiding looking Alekhin in the eyes. "Did you go anywhere today?" "I went to Mariampol. I carried bags. Here is the route sheet." Boriskin readily took out a crumpled piece of paper folded in 4 from the pocket of his tunic and, unfolding it, laid it on the table in front of Alekhin. "Who else was driving your car today?" "Like who?" "Nobody. Maybe they brought someone?" "Not. We are not allowed to. Grocery car. Empty unless you bring an officer, and then your own, from the authorities. And civilians, no. About this vigilance." He spoke so convincingly that one could believe him. It is possible if Alekhin had not seen with his own eyes how Boriskin drove people in a car and received money from the peasants. Meanwhile, the major found in the closet a large notebook in a cardboard cover, standing with his back to Boriskin, laid it out on the table, leafed through and read something that made his face look astonished. Having made some notes, he pushed the notebook to Alekhin. The captain had already guessed that it was Form 4, the personnel record book. Continuing to talk with Boriskin, Alekhin read. "Driver, Corporal. Boriskin Sergei Alexandrovich, born in 1912, B/P. 4th grade education, was not captured or under occupation. In 1936, we are judged under Art. 162nd, 18, P.E. for 5 years. Awards, medals for military merit and for the defense of Moscow." The major marked the criminal record on the side with a pencil. When Alekhin, having looked through the entry about Boriskin, glanced at the major, he sighed knowingly, swaying his heavy belly. "So you didn't pick anyone up today?" Alekhin continued. "Not. No one for the whole journey. Remember better." "What is there to remember?" Boriskin said touchily. "One was driving, why should I lie?" What they want from him, he could not understand, but at first he suggested something completely different. For several years now, he had been mostly clean on hand, but today at dawn before a trip to Mariampol, as if it were a sin, he could not resist and, when the storekeeper turned away, he put a box of American sawn sugar into the truck under the sack container. He did this not because he was tempted to steal or drink, suffering from his stomach. He rarely and little drank, but simply because this storekeeper, with drivers and soldiers, was unreasonably rude, foxed before his superiors, had the fame of a woman's man, often drank and walked in officer uniforms, in a word, succeeded. Sahara, he had several wagons, and, according to Boriskin's concepts, he could not help stealing. And now, after so many years of a righteous life, it was worth stealing, as he was beguiled. So he decided when they called to the head of the warehouse, he was sure that Alekhin was from the military prosecutor's office. Gotcha. And how could this happen? No one saw him, he had no doubt about it, but the sugar was sold to the hucksters in Mariampol, and the remaining 200 grams, wrapped in a rag, lay quietly in the cab under the seat. And they really found out, he couldn't think of it, just as he couldn't understand what this captain's questions had to do with the theft of sugar. Alekhine seemed to him a hardened, cunning man. He's coming up from afar. It was forbidden to give passengers a lift along the way, and even more so to make horses. They did not stroke the head for this, and Boriskin denied everything, immediately deciding that he should not be recognized. And, starting to lie, he lied more and more. And Alekhine's politeness, the same politeness that Boriskin had miserable crumbs in his life, alarmed him even more. Alekhine, on the other hand, tried to clarify to himself why Boriskin was lying, for what purpose. From the very beginning, he believed that the unknown officers were accidental passengers of the I-1-72-15 car, and Boriskin was interested in Alekhine only as a source of obtaining at least some information about these officers for their further search. Alekhine fought with Boriskin for another 10 minutes, and he stubbornly lied until he began to realize that it was not about sugar, but about something else, and since he no longer felt himself guilty of anything essential, he gradually calmed down and became a little more outspoken. However, confessing to a lie was not so easy. "Listen, Boriskin." Alekhine got up and, smiling, approached the driver. "So you say that today no one was brought up? Is that right?" he asked cheerfully, watching the expression on Boriskin's face. "So. However, no more than half an hour ago, here in the city, 2 officers got off your car." Boriskin looked at Alekhine, as if remembering, raised his eyebrows in concern and bit his lip, then stared at the ground with his eyes and, scratching his head and trying to hide some confusion, said, Wait. Oh, yes." He suddenly exclaimed joyfully, getting up, and smiled with relief. "Exactly. I completely forgot. On the way, 2 people asked, and I gave them a ride. And what's wrong with that? What do they need, Pedshadrala to stomp? It's boring as a pedestrian," Alekhine agreed, treating the cheerful Boriskin with a cigarette and lighting a cigarette himself. "Good friends? No, I don't know them." "I'll be a bastard, comrade captain," Boriskin swore, putting his hand to his chest and looking Alekhine in the eyes. "They asked, and I took it. Regretted. Who are they and where did you say? Not. Yes, I didn't ask, I don't need it. I dropped them off near the commandant's office, you saw it. One captain, already in years, bald. Such a courteous person, he gave me newspapers for a smoke." Boriskin rummaged through his pockets and, grinning, asked, "They must have done something?" "And another young lieutenant, he still has a fixation on the left, well, a golden tooth. Through this pity there are only troubles. If I knew such a thing." 19. Evening and night in the city. While Alekhine was talking with Boriskin in the dugout, Timantsev managed to get into the car park, where the ZIS was standing with a broken side, and literally in front of the sentry. He searched the cab and body of the car, not forgetting to look under the seat and in the toolbox. At the very bottom, under an oiled rag, he found sugar wrapped in a rag, thought that it must have been stolen, but could not find anything of interest to the case. The piece of newspaper that Boriskin was given for smoking turned out to be a fragment of today's issue of the Lida newspaper Uparad. Obviously, the unknown people, noticed by Blinov, left Lida in the morning. In the evening they returned to the city and got off at the commandant's office. It remained to establish them among the officers who visited the commandant's office after 19 hours, as well as those living in the neighborhood. The matter seemed to be clear and simple. The commandant of the city, a thin, sunken-cheeked, gloomy-looking major, had known Alekhine since the 41st year, from the battles near Moscow, and was glad to provide assistance. He brought registration books, and Alekhine wrote out 4 officers from among those who lived nearby or had been at the commandant's office in the last hour and a half and, according to the initial data, had some resemblance to the clean-shaven captain and his comrade. Alekhine immediately sent Timantsev to the station. The officers, called from the apartments by order of the commandant, 1 was not found, were quietly shown to Alekhine and Andrei. Alas, there were no people of interest to the scouts among them. And in total in the city, according to the Commandant's office, more than 500 officers from different units and up to 200 seconded were accommodated in private apartments. Look here. The major, taking it out of the safe, laid out on the table a plan of Lida with the designation of the units and formations stationed in the city area. The difficulty is that the outskirts of the city are assigned to parts. These are their cantonment areas. In the northern town and in the southern one, he pointed at the map, their commandant's offices. And we only carry out general supervision. Their records are terrible, and it's really difficult to check for real. Alekin got up. It was dark outside, he had to hurry, but there was nothing more to do in the commandant's office. I spend the night here, said the major, saying goodbye. If you need me, don't worry. They're somewhere around here, in the city, Alekin remarked when he and Andrei went out into the street. Maybe the driver is lying. Maybe he dropped them off at the station, they left, and we will search in vain. I don't think. They asked to be stopped near the commandant's office, but whether they went there or not, he did not see and did not speak. Let's look in the city. Alekin divided the city into sections. For himself he took the station, the surrounding area and the exit along Varshavskaya towards Grodno. Timantsev was entrusted with the southeastern part of the city and the exit to Molodechno. Andrei, a checkpoint at the exit from Lida to Vilna and neighboring streets. After 10, the streets were deserted, a curfew had come. But Andrei kept walking and walking, peering in the dark at the rare passers-by, mostly military men. He carefully watched the single cars that stopped at the checkpoint. At the station, in the premises, on the platform, in all the nooks and crannies, Alekin looked around and already knew everyone. In the barracks for servicemen and in the propaganda center they slept side by side on the floor, on benches and on tables, exhausted from the hot stuffiness and snoring. New passengers did not appear after midnight. The guards on duty at the checkpoint left at 1 in the morning, and very rare cars passed under the barrier raised to the sky without stopping. The streets adjacent to the station seemed to have died out. The nearest passenger train, as Alekin was told in the commandant's office, was supposed to pass only in the morning. At 3 o'clock, barely moving his legs from fatigue, Andrei made his way to the apartment where Kizniak stopped with the car, took off his belt and boots, fell on a wide wooden bed and, barely touching the pillow with his cheek, was already asleep in a dead sleep. He did not hear how Timantsev, returning angry and hungry, looked in the dark for something to eat, cursed in an undertone and grumbled until he lay down. 20. Operational documents. Note on HF. Urgently. Head of the Main Directorate of Counterintelligence. Smersh. In addition to no, and. From. And. August 1944. The search for a transmitter with the call signs of KAO is complicated by the lack of texts of radio intercepts from August 7th and 13th this year. G. Reported by us immediately to the GUKR Smersh for parallel decryption. Given the lack of qualified cryptographers in the front's counterintelligence directorate, I ask for your order for an extraordinary decryption of both intercepts. Taking this opportunity, I consider it my duty to once again draw your attention to the pronounced shortage of operational personnel in the investigation department and in the decryption department of the directorate. During the 7 weeks of the offensive, out of 48 search officers, with a staff of 56, 23 dropped out, and among the remaining 9 people were trainees who did not have sufficient experience in search work. In the decryption department, out of 5 cryptographers enlisted in the state, after a direct hit by a bomb during relocation in the Yashuan district, only 2 young officers remained, unable to quickly decrypt highly reliable cipher systems. Igorov. Note on HF. Igorov. On no, dated August 15, 44. It is not possible in the near future to eliminate the shortage of operational staff in the search department and the decryption department of the front's counterintelligence department. I have given an order for an extraordinary decryption of the interceptions of the 7th and the 13th of August. G. Kalibanov. Cipher telegram. Urgently, Igorov. On no, dated August 13, 44. I inform you that today, August 15th, in the rear of the army, southeast of Sultanishka, a residual group of Germans in the amount of 39 people was discovered and after a shootout liquidated. 17 of them were killed, 4 managed to escape, the rest, partially wounded, were taken prisoner. As established during interrogations, as part of the group, for more than a month, the military personnel of the headquarters of the 4th German Army, the 12th and 337th Infantry Divisions and the 76th Assault moved to the front line from the Mogilev region. The slowness of movement is explained both by extreme caution and by the presence of 8 seriously wounded in the group, including the commander of the 76th Assault Division, Major General Ludwig Hort, and the senior officer of the headquarters of the 4th Army, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Keffer, who were allegedly carried on a makeshift stretcher for about 600 kilometers. The liquidated group had 2 MG-34 heavy machine guns, 27 machine guns, grenades, and an Army shortwave transmitter of the 1942 model from the Telefunken Company. As it turned out during interrogations, on August 13, in the afternoon, after choosing a clearing suitable for the runway, the radio operator of the group went on the air, allegedly asking for the immediate sending of a plane for General Hort, who was dying of gangrene, and 2 more wounded. According to the testimonies of the prisoners Otto Hein and Erich Staub, who during the session were on guard and not far from the transmitter, the place where the radio went on the air is determined to be the northwestern outskirts of the Shilovichi forest. In connection with the death during the skirmish of Lieutenant Colonel Keffer, Sergeant Major Himmel and 2 officers who were directly involved in the radio broadcast, it is not possible to establish its details, in particular call signs, working wave, etc. The testimonies of Gain and Staub do not raise doubts about their authenticity. I think it would be expedient to deliver both of them to the Shilovichi forest area in order to establish the place where the radio went on the air. Bystrov. Cipher telegram. Urgently. Bystrov. On No, dated August 15, 44. By interrogating the prisoners of war of the residual group, establish whether the group's walkie-talkie went on the air before August 13. If so, where, when, and under what circumstances. Of particular interest to us are any information about the cipher or code and the mode of radio transmission. Also find out if the group was engaged in intelligence gathering during their movement, whether they were monitoring railroads and highways. Prisoners of war Hein and Staub should immediately be transferred to LIDA, the counterintelligence department of the Air Corps, to conduct an investigative experiment in order to establish the exact place where the radio went on the air and reproduce the situation and circumstances of the transmission. Igorov. 21, Captain Alekhin. 13 years ago, before he even began to specialize in grain crops, his term paper on cucumbers was published in a collection of the best student papers. 13 years ago, he perfectly knew, and to this day he seems to have not forgotten, the signs and characteristics of all varieties, but he could not determine the ones found by Timantsev at the place where the radio went on the air. Early in the morning he stopped at the bazaar, where a lot of cucumbers were sold in buckets, bags, and by weight. All of them, without exception, were of the same variety type, well known to him, Dalzik, West Russian subgroup. Zelenets is elongated ellipsoidal with a strong runoff to the base, with a narrowed and pointed apex, large tuberculate, black-thorned, trihedral in cross-section. Zelenets length 10 to 14 cm, diameter 4 to 5 cm, weight 100 to 150 g. The color of the fruit is green with large oblong chint spots and light stripes. The cucumbers found in the clearing differed from the Dalzik in shape, in particular, in the rounded edges, and in color, and in the thickness of the green. In the city police, Alekhin was recommended to a well-known vegetable grower here, a local old-timer, in the distant past, a lieutenant of the Russian army, a certain Shorokov Ivan Semenovich. 5 minutes later, leaving the car around the corner, Alekhin approached his house. Shorokov could be found on this street even without an exact address. His plot stood out among other palisades with excellently manicured beds and an abundance of fruit trees. The owner himself, Alekhin saw him from afar, a small, frail old man with a gray-haired transparent fluff around the top of his head, was planing a lath on a workbench under a canopy.